morning the fog rolled in from the coast, the clock above the old station stopped at 3:17. No one noticed it at first. The commuters passing beneath the iron canopy were too busy folding umbrellas, checking phones and stepping around the pale puddles that had gathered between the platform tiles. The station had always been a place of small delays and tired faces, a place where announcements echoed too softly and the morning light arrived in pieces through dirty glass. A stopped clock was not enough to alarm anyone, but by noon, 3 different witnesses would remember looking up at it. By evening, the police would seal off Platform 4, and by the end of the week, a woman named Eleanor Vale would discover that the clock had not stopped because of rust, rain, or age. It had stopped at the exact minute a man disappeared from a train that, according to every official record, never opened its doors. Eleanor was not supposed to become involved. She was not a detective, not a journalist, and not the kind of person who chased strange stories through old neighborhoods and closed archives. At 46, she worked as a records examiner for the Municipal Transport Office, a quiet job inside a grey government building where the windows faced another grey government building across a narrow street. Her work was precise, dull, and mostly invisible. She reviewed maintenance logs, timetable corrections, passenger complaints, budget reports, and the long paper trail of a city that believed every problem could be filed under the right code. She had built her life around that belief. A record could be late, a record could be incomplete, but a record, if handled carefully, usually explained what people had forgotten, hidden, exaggerated, or misunderstood. That was why, when the first report reached her desk, she treated it as a clerical error. It arrived in a brown internal envelope, damp at one corner from the morning rain. Someone from station operations had marked it for review because the incident number did not match the train schedule. Eleanor opened the envelope with a letter knife she kept beside her keyboard and removed 3 sheets. A station supervisor's note, a maintenance request, and a passenger complaint written in an uneven hand. The complaint was brief. A man in a dark coat boarded the 6:42 service from North Quay. He sat across from me. He looked frightened. At Westbridge Station, the lights went out inside the carriage for a few seconds. When they came back, he was gone. The doors had not opened. Eleanor read the lines twice, then looked at the timetable. The 6:42 service had passed through Westbridge at 7:03. That part was correct, but the train had not stopped there. Due to track work, Westbridge Station had been temporarily skipped by morning express services for the past 6 weeks. The doors would have remained locked. The platform staff would not have expected passengers. CCTV should have shown the train moving through without pause. A frightened man vanishing from a carriage was not a transport matter, but a passenger complaint attached to a station maintenance request was. Eleanor marked the file for schedule reconciliation and opened the digital incident system. There was no missing person report linked to the service. There was no security alert. There was no passenger medical emergency. There was only the clock. The station supervisor had written that the platform clock above track 4 froze at 3:17 a.m. and could not be reset remotely. A technician had inspected the wiring and found no obvious fault. Because Westbridge was due for renovation, the matter would normally have been postponed. But the supervisor had added a note in the margin, written in blue pen with more pressure than necessary. Second clock failure this month, same time. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Outside, rain moved across the office windows in thin diagonal lines. Across the room, copy machines hummed. Someone laughed near the break area, then lowered their voice. The day continued around her with the calm indifference of ordinary work. She opened the previous maintenance records for Westbridge Station. The first clock failure had been reported 23 days earlier. Same platform, same time displayed. 3:17. The technician's explanation was moisture inside the housing. A replacement unit had been installed. Eleanor searched for passenger complaints from that date. Nothing appeared at first. Then, after widening the search to include misfiled reports, she found a complaint categorized under lost property. A woman had reported that her husband's briefcase was left on a train after he failed to meet her at their usual stop. According to the file, the man later called her from home, claiming he had changed plans and forgotten to tell her. The complaint had been closed, but there was no record of the briefcase being returned. Eleanor told herself the connection was accidental. Stations produced coincidences the way old buildings produced dust. A broken clock, a nervous passenger, a confused complaint. The mind linked them because it preferred patterns to disorder. Still, she printed both reports. At 5:20 that evening, as the office emptied and the lights changed from white to a tired yellow, Eleanor stayed behind. She told herself she was clearing a backlog. She opened the CCTV access request system and searched for Westbridge Platform 4 on the morning of the latest complaint. The footage was marked available. She entered her authorization code. The video loaded slowly, the image soft and grey. The platform appeared nearly empty. Rainwater shone on the yellow safety line. A cleaner moved at the far end with a cart. The large clock hung beneath the roof beams, its black hands fixed at 3:17, though the timestamp in the corner read 7:2:41. Then the express train entered the frame. It slid through the station without stopping, windows bright against the dim platform. Eleanor watched the carriages pass one by one. In several windows she could see passengers, heads bowed over phones, shoulders pressed into coats, faces washed pale by fluorescent light. She slowed the footage. The third carriage passed, then the fourth. For less than a second, in one of the windows, a man in a dark coat stood facing the glass. He was not seated. He was not moving toward the doors. His hand was raised against the window, palm open, as if touching the cold surface from inside. Eleanor paused the video. The image blurred around him, but his face was visible enough to show one thing clearly. He was looking directly at the platform clock. She rewound the clip and played it again. The train did not stop. The doors did not open. No one stepped onto the platform. The cleaner never looked up. The man appeared in the window, passed through the frame, and was gone. Eleanor searched the next station's arrival footage. The train stopped there 4 minutes later. Passengers stepped out. The man in the dark coat did not. She checked the carriage interior camera, expecting a simple answer. Perhaps he had moved seats, collapsed out of view, entered a restroom, or been blocked by other passengers. But the interior camera from that carriage was missing from the archive. Not corrupted, not damaged, missing. In its place was a blank entry with a note automatically generated by the system. File removed by authorized user. Eleanor sat very still. The office around her had gone quiet. The cleaners had not yet arrived. The only sound was the low electrical breath of computers left running overnight. On her screen, the man's frozen image waited in silence. One hand lifted toward the window, his face caught between fear and recognition. She opened the access log. The file had been removed at 3:17 a.m. Not 7:03, when the train passed Westbridge. Not 8:10, when the first complaint was received. 3:17, the same minute shown on the stopped clock. Eleanor felt the first true unease then. Not fear exactly. Fear was immediate and sharp. This was slower. It moved through her like cold water entering a room beneath a closed door. She printed the access log, folded it once, and placed it inside her notebook. Then she shut down the video, cleared her screen, and locked the printed reports in her desk drawer. She should have gone home. Instead, she took the late tram across the river to Westbridge. The station looked smaller at night. Its old brick walls were dark with rain, and the roof beams disappeared into shadow above the platforms. Most of the renovation lights were off. A few temporary lamps cast white pools along the tracks. Somewhere beyond the fence, traffic moved across the bridge with a wet, continuous hiss. Eleanor stood on platform 4 and looked up. The clock was still there, 3:17. The station was almost empty. A railway employee in a reflective jacket spoke quietly into a radio near the stairs. A woman with a suitcase waited under the canopy. A paper cup rolled along the platform edge, pushed by the wind. Eleanor took out her phone and photographed the clock. As she lowered it, she noticed something scratched into the painted metal of the bench beside her. The letters were small and uneven, as though carved quickly with a key. She bent closer. Not a name, not a date. A sentence. Do not trust the arrival board. For several seconds, Eleanor did not move. The rain tapped against the roof. A train announcement crackled somewhere overhead, distorted by static. Across the tracks, the electronic arrival board flickered once, went black, then returned with a destination Eleanor did not recognize. The next train was listed as arriving in 3 minutes. but no train was scheduled for platform 4 that night. Clara Evans had not always been afraid of open spaces. There had been a time, before London narrowed around her, when she could walk through a railway concourse without counting exits, stand on a bridge without feeling the weight of the air below, and cross a busy square without imagining every face turning toward her at once. She had once moved through the world with a practical confidence that suited her work. Archives, docks, council basements, parish halls, maritime museums with leaking roofs. She had gone wherever old records needed sorting and forgotten histories needed rescuing from damp boxes. Then came the afternoon at St. Pancras. It was not something she spoke about, not in detail. People who knew her well understood only the outline. A sudden crowd surge during an evacuation, a fall near the escalators, someone screaming, the sensation of being unable to breathe, while hundreds of feet moved too close around her. There had been no lasting physical injury, no heroic rescue, no headline that would make the event easy to explain. But afterward, the world had changed shape. Doorways became thresholds to be negotiated. Pavements became exposed corridors. Car parks, stations, supermarkets, even beaches at low tide opened into a kind of emptiness that felt less like freedom than danger. So Clara had returned to Cornwall, not to the postcard Cornwall of summer traffic, ice creams and cheerful families leaning into Atlantic wind, but to a quieter edge of it. A narrow stone cottage outside Porthleven, where the lanes were bordered by hedges bent inland by weather, and the sea could be heard before it could be seen. The cottage sat half a mile from the coastal path, close enough for gulls to scream above the chimney, far enough from the village that no one came by unless they had reason. Inside, Clara built a life of manageable distances. Her desk faced a small window with bubbled old glass. Beyond it lay a patch of garden, a low wall, a tilted rowan tree, and on clear days, the faintest silver suggestion of water between two hills. The room itself was narrow and crowded, made smaller by bookshelves, document boxes, scanners, external hard drives, and folders labelled in Clara's neat block capitals. Admiralty charts, harbour board minutes, wreck inquiries, lighthouse service correspondence, Coast Guard logs, digitised and cross-referenced. If the outside world had become too wide, the archive offered a world she could hold in categories. She worked for the Cornish Maritime Records Trust, a small institution that occupied 2 damp rooms in a converted customs building near Falmouth, and existed on grants, private donations, and the devotion of people who believed that local history did not become less important because it was quiet. Clara's official title was Maritime Historical Archivist and Digital Records Manager, a role broad enough to mean almost anything. She catalogued 19th century logbooks. She restored damaged scans. She corrected metadata written by temporary interns who confused fishing vessels with pilot boats. She maintained public access databases for researchers, family historians, students, and the occasional retired naval officer who insisted his grandfather's cutter had been misidentified in an exhibition caption. Most days, Clara did not need to leave her cottage. That suited her, and it suited the trust. She was efficient, methodical, and willing to do the patient work no one else wanted. She could spend 6 hours aligning faded harbour ledgers against tide tables and emerge with a pattern that changed the interpretation of an entire wreck report. She could identify a mislabeled photograph from the curve of a headland or the shape of a lantern room against cloud. She knew the Cornish coast not as tourists knew it, but as a long sequence of recorded hazards, reefs, shoals, fog banks, wreck sites, smuggling routes, collapsed mine workings, dead men's steps, fishermen's warnings passed down through families until they hardened into place names. Her colleagues admired her in the safe, distant way people admire someone whose difficulties do not inconvenience them too much. They called her brilliant. They called her private. They told one another not to take it personally when she declined staff lunches, public talks, grant receptions, and annual gatherings at the museum. Clara accepted this arrangement. She contributed from behind a screen. She answered emails promptly. She avoided video calls when possible, claiming bandwidth problems that were only sometimes invented. On ordinary mornings, she rose at 5:40. She did this even in winter, when the cottage stayed black until nearly 8, and the sea wind pushed rain against the windows with the persistence of fingers. She made tea in a brown pot, fed the cat that had adopted her 3 years earlier, and opened the study before the heating had properly taken hold. The cat, a scarred grey Tom she had named Bosun, watched from the rug as Clara began the day's checks. Server status, overnight backups, public archive requests, automated lighthouse feeds. The last category had been added only 18 months before, when several old navigational sites along the Cornish coast were upgraded under a national maritime modernisation scheme. The programme had been described in public documents as a safety improvement. Remote monitoring, reduced maintenance delays, higher resolution coastal observation, better integration with weather data and erosion modelling. For Clara's work, it meant access to continuous visual records from several automated lighthouses and beacon stations, including the one on Blackrock Point. Blackrock was not famous in the way some lighthouses were famous. It had no romantic visitor centre, no summer queues, no dramatic ghost story printed on tea towels. It stood on a hard tooth of land beyond Kinant's Cove, where the cliffs darkened after rain and the sea broke white around offshore rocks. The original structure dated from the late 19th century, built after a cargo steamer misjudged the coastline in fog and split open within sight of land. For more than a century, keepers had lived there in shifts, recording weather, lamp performance, vessels sighted, and the slow damage of salt and wind. Then automation came. The keepers left. The building was sealed. Contractors visited according to schedule. Cameras watched the sea in all directions. For Clara, Blackrock Point was useful because its feed captured the cliff face south of the old cove, where winter storms had been eating into the headland. The local council wanted historical comparisons for erosion planning. Clara had been asked to assemble a long visual sequence from archived feeds, environmental logs, and old survey photographs. It was the kind of task she liked. Impersonal, precise, and safely distant. She could watch the coast without standing on it. The day after she noticed the gull, Clara tried to prove herself wrong. She began with the simplest explanations. Compression artifact, frame interpolation error, archive indexing mismatch, a temporary playback issue caused by corrupted video segments. She had seen all of these before. Digital records were more fragile than the public imagined. They gave an impression of certainty because they looked clean. But beneath every timestamp was a chain of systems, settings, human choices, and small failures waiting to be overlooked. She reopened the footage from 3:14 a.m. The room around her was still dark, though it was late morning now. She had drawn the curtains halfway against the glare, leaving a blade of pale light across the floorboards. Bosun slept beneath the radiator. The kettle clicked in the kitchen and cooled untouched. On the screen, the Blackrock feed showed the lighthouse beam sweeping across a black sea. Wind buffeted the camera housing. A faint line of surf appeared and vanished along the rocks below. The timestamp in the lower right corner advanced normally. 03:13:58, 03:13:59, 03:14 Surn. Nothing happened at first. Then the gull crossed the frame. It should not have been there. Not at that hour, not in that light, and certainly not repeating the exact movement she had seen before. It moved from left to right above the cliff edge, wings angled against the wind. Clara leaned closer. The image was poor, but not poor enough to hide the impossible detail. After 3 seconds, the gull appeared to drift backward. Not because it was flying backward, but because the footage had been reversed into itself with such care that the join was almost invisible. Almost. Clara placed one finger on the edge of the monitor, marking the gull's position. She watched the sea below. The same crest of foam rose against the same rock, shattered in the same pattern, withdrew in the same white threads. The lighthouse beam crossed the lens. A smear of rain moved diagonally across the image. Then it all happened again. 4 minutes. No jump, no warning, no obvious break in the timestamp. A perfect loop. The discovery should have remained technical. A problem in the archive, an error to report to system support with a screenshot and a polite message. But Clara did not report it. Not yet. Instead, she opened older footage. 3 days earlier, at 3:14 a.m., the same 4-minute anomaly appeared. No gull that time, but a spray pattern repeated twice against the rocks. 3 days before that, a fishing buoy near the edge of the frame bobbed in an identical rhythm, then returned to its starting point as if the sea had forgotten how to move forward. Clara checked the next date, then the next. Every 72 hours, always 3:14 a.m., always 4 minutes. At midday, her phone rang. She flinched at the sound, then saw the Trust's number. It was Martin Prowse, the director. He had the gentle, distracted voice of a man permanently surrounded by underfunded responsibilities. "Clara, sorry to bother you. Just checking you received the erosion sequence request from County Hall." "Yes," she said, eyes still on the footage. "I'm working through it." "Good. No rush beyond the unreasonable rush they've invented for themselves. Anything odd in the Blackrock files?" The question was casual, routine, exactly the kind of question one colleague asked another without meaning anything beneath it. Still, Clara's hand paused over the keyboard. "Odd how?" "Oh, you know, missing weather packets, dead pixels, contractor nonsense. They automated the place and now somehow need more people to explain what the machines are doing." She almost told him. The words rose halfway and stopped. A loop every 72 hours. 4 minutes removed without appearing removed. A gull flying backward through an official maritime archive. Spoken aloud, it sounded absurd. "Nothing I can't handle," Clara said. Martin accepted this at once. He trusted her competence, which meant he rarely questioned her silence. They spoke briefly about funding paperwork, a visiting researcher from Exeter, and a collection of harbour dues receipts that had been damaged by mould. Then the call ended, and Clara was alone again with the screen. The afternoon dimmed. Rain swept in from the west and blurred the cottage window. The room smelled faintly of dust, warm plastic, and tea leaves left too long in the pot. Clara ran checks on file hashes, camera metadata, and server timestamps. The files claimed to be continuous. The archive checksum showed no corruption. The monitoring system reported no outage. Whoever or whatever had created the loop had not simply covered a gap. It had taught the record to deny that a gap had ever existed. By 6 o'clock, Clara's shoulders ached. She stood, stretched, and walked to the kitchen. The cottage felt suddenly too quiet. Outside, the lane was empty, hedgerows tossing in the wind. The world beyond the glass had the flat grey look of late autumn, when day did not end so much as sink. She tried to make supper. Soup from a carton, bread from the freezer. She ate 3 spoonfuls and left the rest untouched. At 8:12 p.m., she returned to the study and checked the current live feed from Blackrock Point. The lighthouse beam moved over the sea with steady obedience. For a while, nothing seemed wrong. Then Clara noticed the maintenance status panel beside the feed. A contractor login had accessed the Blackrock system 40 minutes earlier, not unusual by itself. Contractors performed remote diagnostics all the time, but the account name made her uneasy because she had seen it before in the older system logs, always within 12 hours of the looped footage. Kernow Marine Systems, Field Admin. Clara searched the maintenance schedule. The next routine inspection was not due for 11 days. She opened the contractor notes. No update had been filed. For several minutes, she sat very still, listening to the rain and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. She told herself there were explanations. There were always explanations. A forgotten diagnostic, a software patch, a contractor too lazy to write notes. None of this required fear. But fear did not wait for proof. It moved first through the body before reason caught up. Clara closed the live feed, then opened it again through a separate archive mirror. The image returned. The dark coast, the sweep of light, the restless water. She increased the brightness. Most of the frame dissolved into grain, but the cove below the lighthouse became faintly visible. At first, she thought she was seeing a rock. Then the shape shifted. Not enough to be clear. Not enough to name. Just a darker form in the water where the tide should have been breaking cleanly over stone. Clara leaned toward the screen until her reflection appeared faintly over the image. A pale, tired woman in a dark cardigan, eyes too wide, face divided by pixels and rain. The lighthouse beam swept across the cove. For 1 second, the shape vanished into brightness. When the darkness returned, it was gone. Clara checked the timestamp. The next 72-hour interval would fall at 3:14 a.m. in 2 nights. And for the first time in years, the thing she feared most was no longer outside her door. It was waiting inside the record, counting down. Clara Evans trusted patterns more than instinct. Instinct had become unreliable after London. It made the world too loud. It turned distant footsteps into pursuit, open streets into traps, a ringing phone into a warning. Pattern, by contrast, asked nothing of her nerves. Pattern waited to be measured. It did not care whether she was frightened. It cared only whether the numbers returned the same result twice. So the following morning, before the sun had risen properly over the wet fields beyond her cottage, Clara began the investigation as if it were an archival error. She made tea, set it beside the keyboard, and opened a new folder on an encrypted drive she usually reserved for fragile collections. She named it BLK Temp Review, a deliberately boring title, the sort of label no one would notice in a directory full of coastal surveys and lighthouse maintenance exports. Then she downloaded a local copy of the publicly available Blackrock Point footage from the previous 6 months. Not the restricted feed, not yet. Only what the Trust was already permitted to store. Outside, the morning was colourless. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the garden flattened and shining. Bosun sat on the windowsill, tail flicking, watching gulls wheel somewhere beyond the cottage roof. Clara worked in a thick jumper, her fingers cold despite the radiator ticking beside her. The room still held the closed-in smell of old paper, dust and sea damp that had become part of the cottage itself. She began with a manual review. Every third day, 3:14 a.m., 4 minutes, she marked each segment in a spreadsheet with columns for date, weather, tide, visibility, moon phase, camera noise, and any repeated environmental feature. Foam pattern, rain streak, lens flare, bird movement, buoy position, lighthouse sweep. The first 6 entries could have been coincidence if she wanted badly enough to believe in coincidence. By the 10th, the belief became harder to maintain. By the 17th, it was gone. The loop was real. It did not always repeat the same scene. That was what made it sophisticated. Someone had not simply copied one 4-minute clip and pasted it over every gap. Each event used footage from the same night, close enough in time that the weather and lighting matched, then blended it into the official feed with almost invisible care. The timestamp advanced. The audio hiss continued. The sea appeared to move. The lighthouse beam performed its rotation, but for 4 minutes, the record was not observing the present. It was replaying a carefully chosen past. Clara sat back and pressed her hands over her eyes. Her first thought was not of crime. It was of cost. To fake one camera feed once was possible with access and skill. To maintain the deception every 72 hours across months required something else. Permission, persistence, or a system designed to make interference look routine. It required someone who knew when the footage would be checked, how the archive verified continuity, and which logs would appear harmless to outside auditors. It required proximity. Clara opened the contractor records. Kernow Marine Systems had been hired as a regional maintenance provider during the automation upgrade. The company's public description was ordinary enough. Marine electrical work, remote monitoring equipment, navigation safety systems, harbor camera installation, emergency call-out support. Their office was listed in an industrial estate outside Redruth. The website showed men in orange waterproofs smiling beside junction boxes, wind turbines, and harbor lights. Nothing about it looked remarkable. That, Clara thought, was often how remarkable things survived. She downloaded the maintenance logs associated with Blackrock Point. There were hundreds of entries: remote diagnostics, battery checks, lantern calibration, lens housing temperature, camera firmware updates, weather station resets. Most were automated, some were signed manually by field technicians. She sorted by date, then by time. The first alignment appeared so neatly that she almost missed it. On every day the loop occurred, a remote access session from Kernow Marine Systems began sometime between midnight and 2:40 a.m. Each session had a normal technical label: lens alignment review, telemetry sync, watchdog restart, moisture sensor diagnostic. None of the sessions overlapped directly with the 4-minute gap. They ended earlier, leaving no obvious connection, but always before 3:14, always within the same window. Clara copied the entries into her spreadsheet. Her unease sharpened, though she still resisted naming it. A corrupt contractor could explain a great deal. So could lazy maintenance routines, badly configured software, or an automated script set by someone who no longer worked there. The mind, she knew, was capable of building monsters out of poorly documented infrastructure. She needed something outside the system, not camera data, not contractor notes. Something that did not depend on the same record being truthful. She pulled up tide tables from the hydrographic office, then weather archives from the Met office, then automatic identification system records for vessels broadcasting near the Cornish coast. AIS data had limits. Small craft could switch off their transponders. Some boats never carried them. Signals could be lost in poor conditions or distorted by terrain. But legitimate commercial vessels usually appeared somewhere in the records, even briefly. Clara overlaid the Blackrock loop dates with vessel traffic. For the first hour, nothing emerged. Fishing boats, cargo traffic far offshore, a Coast Guard training exercise, a maintenance vessel near Falmouth, normal coastal movement. The screen filled with dots and lines, little electronic certainties crossing a map of dark water. Then she filtered for absence. Not what appeared near Blackrock during the 4-minute blind spot, but what appeared before and after it. On the nights of the loopers, a small service vessel regularly passed west of the Lizard shortly after midnight, broadcasting under different names but with similar dimensions and movement patterns. Sometimes it identified as a survey craft, sometimes as a cable inspection tender, twice as a private support vessel. Its track never approached Blackrock Point directly. It stayed far enough offshore to look irrelevant, but each time, around 3 o'clock a.m., the signal degraded, not vanished. That would have been too obvious. It became noisy, intermittent, scattered across several points as if the vessel had slowed, turned, or entered an area of poor reception. Then, after 3:20, the track resumed its previous course and moved away. Clara leaned closer. She pulled the tide chart for one of the nights. At 3:14 a.m., the tide at Blackrock Cove was turning. She checked another date. Turning tide, another. The same. Not exactly high water, not exactly low. The brief slack interval between movements when the sea paused in its long argument with the land. Clara had spent enough time with old wreck reports to know sailors respected those moments. A slack tide could make a narrow approach possible. It could give a small craft a temporary kindness in water that was otherwise dangerous. She opened a satellite map. Blackrock Cove was barely marked. From above, it looked like a bite taken out of the coast, a dark notch beneath cliffs too steep for casual access. There was no proper beach, only rock shelves and a narrow channel where water pushed between submerged stone. Local histories mentioned old landing places used by fishermen before the road network improved. Older histories, more cautiously written, mentioned contraband. Cornwall carried such stories everywhere. Smuggling was part of its folklore, softened by time into romance. Lanterns in windows, kegs beneath floorboards, customs men tricked by clever villagers. Clara had catalogued enough court records to know the reality had been colder. Smuggling was logistics. It was violence when necessary. It was silence enforced by debt, fear, and profit. The costumes changed. The coastline did not. She stared at the map until the shape of the cove began to trouble her. The automated lighthouse stood above it. The camera watched the sea around it. The system was supposed to remove uncertainty from that piece of coast. But every 72 hours, precisely when the tide made the cove briefly usable, the record looked away. Clara stood abruptly and walked into the kitchen. The room was too bright, the window too exposed. She filled the kettle, spilled water onto the counter, and had to grip the edge of the sink until the tightness in her chest loosened. Outside the glass, the lane remained empty. A pheasant moved through the wet grass near the wall. Nothing was happening. No one was watching her. She repeated this silently. Nothing is happening. No one is watching. Then the landline rang. The sound struck through the cottage with such force that Bosun bolted from the study. Clara did not move at first. The phone rang again, and again. She crossed the kitchen slowly and looked at the display. Number withheld. Most people would have let it go. Clara almost did. But there was a stubbornness in her that survived fear. A small, hard thing built from years of being told gently to rest, to step back, to avoid stress, to make her world smaller until it became safe. She answered. For 2 seconds, there was only line noise. Then a man's voice said, "Miss Evans?" The accent was local, but carefully neutral, as if the speaker had learned to sand down the edges of where he came from. "Yes. This is Daniel Hart, Systems Liaison for Kernow Marine. We noticed some unusual archive requests from your trust account." Clara looked toward the study door. Her screen was still open, the spreadsheet, the vessel tracks, the tide charts. "My work involves archive requests," she said. "Of course, nothing improper. We just wanted to check whether you were experiencing trouble with the Blackrock feed." The words were polite. The silence after them was not. Clara felt a chill move across the back of her neck. Why would I be? A faint breath on the line. Not quite a laugh. Legacy data can produce strange artifacts, especially in poor weather. It's best not to overinterpret them. She did not answer. "Are you preparing a report for someone?" he asked. "No." "Good, then there's no problem." The line clicked dead. Clara remained with the receiver in her hand long after the call ended. The kitchen seemed changed now, though nothing in it had moved. The sink, the kettle, the rain-spotted window, the stack of unopened post by the bread bin. Ordinary things, all of them suddenly arranged inside a larger silence. She returned to the study and checked her archive account logs. There it was. A security flag had been attached to her downloads at 10:43 a.m. The reason given was bulk access review. Standard administrative language, harmless unless one understood what it meant. Someone had noticed her looking. For a while, Clara simply sat in the dim light, listening to the wind pressing against the cottage walls. Her life had been arranged to avoid moments like this. Not danger itself, perhaps, but the possibility of being pulled into the open by something she could not control. Then she opened a new document and began writing a script. Not a report, not an accusation, a tool. It would scan the archive for repeating visual sequences across all Blackrock footage, compare the anomalies with tide shifts, contractor logins, and AIS irregularities, and produce a table no one could dismiss as a nervous woman seeing patterns in rain. Her hands trembled at first, then they steadied. By midnight, the script was running. Lines of data moved down the screen. Dates, timestamps, similarity scores, file paths, weather markers. The cottage creaked around her. The sea wind rose. Somewhere in the dark beyond the window, the coastline waited, blind for 4 minutes every 3 days. At 1:26 a.m., the first results appeared. Clara expected dozens of entries. She got hundreds. The anomaly had not begun 6 months earlier. It had been happening for nearly 4 years. By dawn, Clara Evans had stopped thinking of the anomaly as a glitch. The word no longer fit. A glitch was accidental. A glitch happened once, or twice, or often enough to irritate a technician who then logged it, patched it, and forgot about it. A glitch did not return every 72 hours with the patience of a tide table. A glitch did not begin before the lighthouse was publicly described as fully automated. A glitch did not align itself with contractor access, missing vessel signals, and slack water beneath one of the least accessible points of the Cornish coast. The script ran until the cottage windows turned grey. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket at her desk, watching the results populate in rows so numerous they no longer looked like discovery but accusation. 4 years of Blackrock Point recordings, 4 years of concealed intervals, 4 minutes at a time. The gaps were almost elegant in their restraint. Never enough to draw attention, never during daylight, never during storms violent enough to require emergency review, never when tourist boats or Coast Guard training exercises were nearby. The blind spot lived inside the record like a well-behaved parasite. She exported the results into a spreadsheet, then into a second encrypted backup. Habit made her careful. Fear made her more so. She copied the data to a small black external drive and placed it in an old biscuit tin beneath a stack of 19th century Harbour Dues books. Then she stood, slowly, because her back had stiffened, and looked at the room around her. Everything seemed absurdly normal. The cat bowl needed washing. The tea beside her keyboard had gone cold. A draft moved under the study door. On the floor near the wastebasket lay a curled receipt from the village shop. The life she had made for herself, small and defended, remained intact. Yet somewhere within that life, A line had been crossed during the night. She could no longer return to the person who had believed she was studying an archive fault. She had found a system, and systems belong to people. At 8:10 a.m., she called Martin Prowse. He answered on the fourth ring, breathless, as if he had been climbing stairs. In the background, Clara could hear the particular echo of the Trust's Falmouth office. Old stone, thin carpets, gulls outside, someone moving a chair across a floor that had never been level. "Clara," he said, "everything all right?" She nearly said yes. The word was ready. It had become her easiest lie. Instead, she said, "I need to ask you something about Blackrock." There was a small pause, not dramatic, not suspicious, just long enough for Clara to notice it. "All right," Martin said. "When did the Trust first gain access to the automated feed?" "Officially, about 18 months ago, around the time of the erosion grant." "Unofficially?" Another pause. "Why do you ask?" Clara turned her chair toward the window. Beyond the glass, a weak morning light had settled on the wet garden. The rowan branches moved in quick, nervous motions. Because the archive contains Blackrock footage going back almost 4 years, some of it appears to have been imported from a pre-existing monitoring system, and there are anomalies in it. Anomalies? Repeated 4-minute segments, every 72 hours, always at 3:14 a.m. This time, Martin said nothing. Clara waited. The silence was not empty. She could hear office noise behind it, footsteps passing near Martin's door, the faint ring of another phone somewhere in the building. Then the sound changed. A door closed. When Martin spoke again, his voice was lower. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "How certain?" "I wrote a script overnight. It found hundreds of instances." A breath. "You should not have done that from your Trust account." The words landed with a dull weight. Clara looked at the spreadsheet on her screen. "You knew there was something wrong." "I didn't know." "But you suspected." Martin did not answer quickly. Clara had known him for 9 years. He was a gentleman in most ways, careful with staff, careful with donors, careful with the small dignity of local historians who brought in boxes of documents, believing each one might matter. He disliked conflict. He avoided speculation. He would rather understate a problem until the ceiling fell in than accuse anyone without proof. When he finally spoke, he sounded older. "There was someone before you who noticed irregularities." Clara sat still. "Who?" "An external volunteer, retired engineer. He helped us during the first digitization phase, before the Trust had proper funding for the feeds. His name was Peter Lanyon." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Martin said it made the room feel colder. "What did he find?" "I'm not sure he found anything conclusive. He had concerns about the early Blackrock imports, timing inconsistencies, missing sensor packets. He believed some sections of the feed were being substituted." "When?" 3 years ago." Clara closed her eyes briefly. The anomaly had been active then. "What happened to his report?" "It never became a report." "Martin." "He sent me notes," Martin said, and now there was strain in his voice. "Informal notes. He was going to come in with a drive and walk me through it. Then he changed his mind." "Why?" "He said he'd made a mistake." Clara knew before asking that this would not be the whole answer. "And did you believe him?" Another silence. "No." Outside, a van passed the lane beyond the hedge, its tires hissing on wet tarmac. Clara's shoulders tightened until the sound faded. "What happened to Peter Lanyon?" "He moved away, I think. Up north, maybe. We lost contact." "You think?" "I tried calling him a few months later. The number was disconnected. His email bounced. I didn't push it." Martin exhaled, a tired, ashamed sound. "Funding was uncertain. We were negotiating access agreements. Kernow Marine were part of the wider infrastructure contract, and I had nothing I could prove. I convinced myself Peter had been embarrassed and wanted to disappear from the project quietly." Clara looked at the rows on her screen, all those neat timestamps arranged like evidence no one had wanted to assemble. "Do you still have his notes?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." Martin did not respond. "Please," Clara said, "if he noticed this 3 years ago, I need to see what he saw." The line remained quiet for so long, she thought he might hang up. Then he said, There's an old box in the map room. Uncatalogued contractor correspondence, early automation material, some volunteer paperwork. I kept Peter's envelope there because I didn't know what else to do with it. Can you scan it? I'll look. Now? You don't understand, Martin said softly. If this is what you think it is, scanning it through the office system might not be wise. Clara's hand tightened around the phone. He was right. That frightened her more than if he had dismissed everything. I'll come in, she said. The words were out before she could prepare herself for them. Martin seemed to hear the cost of them. He knew enough about her life not to respond too quickly. You don't have to do that today. Yes, Clara said, though her pulse had already begun to rise. I do. After the call ended, Clara remained at her desk, staring not at the spreadsheet, but at her reflection in the dark portion of the monitor. The thought of leaving the cottage had weight. It pressed against her chest, moved into her throat, made the familiar room tilt slightly at the edges. Falmouth was only a drive away. People made such journeys without ceremony every day. They bought milk, they went to work. They parked near the harbour and complained about the weather. For Clara, the route had become a map of hazards. The open road down through Helston, the roundabout near the retail park, the exposed stretch where the fields widened on both sides, the car park by the quay, the walk from the car to the trust side entrance, perhaps only 40 yards, but 40 yards of sky, gulls, strangers, and no wall close enough to touch. She went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. The woman in the mirror looked capable only because she was still indoors. Her hair was pinned badly. There were shadows under her eyes. She tried to breathe in counts, the way the therapist in Truro had taught her years before. 4 in. Hold, 6 out. Again. By 10:30, she had dressed in a navy coat, boots, and the grey scarf her sister had given her for Christmas. She placed the external drive in her inside pocket, then changed her mind and put it beneath a loose floorboard in the study. She copied a smaller subset of the data onto an ordinary memory stick, the kind that looked as if it might contain presentation slides or old invoices. That went into her handbag. She told Bosun she would be back by tea. The cat blinked at her without conviction. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and cut grass. Clara locked the cottage door and stood beneath the low porch, keys in hand, looking at her car parked beside the wall. The distance was 12 steps. She counted them before she took them. 1, 2. By 6, her breath had shortened. By 9, she almost turned back. By 12, her hand was on the car door. The drive to Falmouth passed in fragments, hedgerows sliding by, rain beginning again, a tractor forcing her to slow on a narrow lane, the sound of the heater blowing too loudly. Her own knuckles pale on the steering wheel. At the edge of town, traffic thickened and her vision narrowed. The world becoming signs, brake lights, wet windscreens, pedestrians under hoods, a bus pulling out too sharply. She parked behind the customs building with a kind of exhausted disbelief, as if the journey itself had been an argument she had somehow won. Martin met her at the side entrance. He was in his late 50s, tall and slightly stooped, with reading glasses pushed onto his head and a wool cardigan beneath his jacket. He looked relieved to see her, then guilty for being relieved. "Come through," he said. The trust's office smelled of damp paper, old wood, and coffee that had been left too long on a hot plate. Clara had once loved the smell. Now it seemed to press around her. She kept close to the wall as they moved down the corridor, passing framed photographs of fishing crews, wrecked steamers, lifeboat launches, faces from another century staring out with the guarded patience of people who had known the sea could take anything. The map room was at the back. It had no windows, which helped. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling, stacked with rolled charts, survey plans, deed boxes, and flat files too large for one person to move safely. Martin shut the door behind them and crossed to a metal cabinet in the corner. The cabinet drawer resisted, then opened with a scrape. "I should have dealt with this properly," he said. Clara said nothing. He lifted out a cardboard archive box with no formal label, only a strip of masking tape across the lid. In faded ink, someone had written automation early. Inside were folders, manuals, correspondence printouts, access agreements, equipment lists, and several envelopes. Martin found one near the bottom. It was cream-colored and bent at one corner. Clara noticed at once that it had not been filed flat like the others. It had been pushed down the side of the box, as if hidden in haste or shame. Martin handed it to her. On the front, in careful blue handwriting, was his name, M. Prowse, private. Clara opened it. Inside were 6 printed screenshots, 3 pages of handwritten notes, and a folded Ordnance Survey map of the Blackrock coastline. The notes were orderly at first, then increasingly hurried. Peter Lanyon had documented timing discrepancies in the feed, repeated environmental signatures, and maintenance sessions that did not match declared work orders. He had also drawn a small diagram of the lighthouse beam and the cove below it. One sentence near the bottom had been underlined twice. The light is not only being watched, it is being aimed. Clara read it again. Martin leaned over her shoulder. What does that mean? She did not answer immediately. Her eyes had moved to the last page. There, Peter had written something different. Not technical notes, not timings. A message. If I am wrong, this is just an old man frightening himself with shadows. If I am right, the gap is not empty. Something comes ashore when the camera lies. Below the message, in smaller writing, almost squeezed into the margin, was one final line. Do not contact Kerno Marine. One of them came to my house. Clara read the last line 3 times before she allowed herself to look up. Do not contact Kerno Marine. One of them came to my house. The words seemed too plain to belong with the rest of Peter Lanyon's notes. Everything before them had been measured. Timestamps, angles, tide marks, feed comparisons, access sessions. A man trained to solve problems had been building an argument piece by piece. Careful enough not to overclaim, disciplined enough to separate observation from fear. Then the fear had entered the page. Martin Prowse stood beside her in the map room, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his face pale beneath the yellow overhead light. Outside the closed door, the trust carried on in its ordinary way. A kettle boiled somewhere. A phone rang twice and stopped. Someone laughed softly in the corridor. The sounds made the message more disturbing, not less. Danger should have announced itself with thunder, with breaking glass, with footsteps running down the hall. Instead, it had arrived folded inside an old envelope, hidden for 3 years beneath contractor manuals and grant paperwork. Did he tell you that? Clara asked. Martin shook his head slowly. No. Did he mention anyone visiting him? No. When he sent the envelope, he wrote that we should speak in person. Then 2 days later, he called and said he had been mistaken. Mistaken about what? All of it, apparently. Martin's voice tightened. He said the timing issue was an artifact of the import process. He apologized for wasting my time. And you believed him? I wanted to. It was not a defense. Clara could hear that. It was a confession, spoken by a man who had spent years arranging the event into a shape he could live with. A volunteer had become overexcited. A technical concern had resolved itself. A small charity with fragile funding had avoided conflict with a contractor tied to a national infrastructure program. No one had been harmed, at least not in any way the trust could prove. Only now, standing under the low ceiling of the map room, did the compromise show its cost. Clara laid the pages on the table. Peter's folded map was creased from handling. He had marked the coastline around Blackrock in pencil, circling the lighthouse, the cliff road, a disused Coast Guard track, and the narrow cove below. The marks were neat but faint, as if he had not wanted to press too hard. Near the cove, he had drawn a small arrow toward a patch of water just offshore and written 3 letters. UDZ. Clara frowned. Martin leaned closer. What is that? I don't know. She reached for the handwritten notes again. Peter had used abbreviations throughout, most of them obvious. LT for Lighthouse Tower, CAM for camera, KMS for Kerno Marine Systems, AIS for vessel data, but UDZ appeared only twice more, both times beside rough tide calculations. It was not a standard archival term, not one Clara recognized from maritime records either. She turned to the screenshots. The first 3 were from the Blackrock feed. Grainy night images, sea, cliff, sweep of light. On the 4th, Peter had brightened the lower corner until the image became almost unreadable. A square of grey noise and white scratches. Yet within it, something darker interrupted the water near the mouth of the cove. Clara had seen a similar shape on the live feed, a darker form, present for a moment, gone when the beam returned. Peter had circled it. Beneath the printout, he had written, "Not a rock. Moves against tide." The fifth screenshot showed a maintenance interface. Clara recognized the layout at once. Early remote control software for the automated lantern assembly. A row of technical readings ran down one side. Rotation speed, lamp temperature, power draw, motor calibration, optic alignment. Peter had highlighted a single value. Azimuth correction, 2.4 degrees. The sixth screenshot showed another night, another maintenance session. Azimuth correction, 2.4 degrees. Clara felt the pieces shift quietly in her mind. A lighthouse beam was not just a light, it was geometry. It moved through darkness according to a pattern, marking danger, orientation, and distance. If its rotation angle changed subtly, even for a few minutes, it could alter what was visible from the cliffs, from the water, from cameras, from ships, from anyone watching the coast. A small adjustment would mean nothing to casual observers, but in a narrow cove at slack tide, under cloud, with the camera feed looped at the same time, 2 degrees could be enough to hide a landing, or illuminate one for people who needed guidance. "The light is not only being watched," Clara murmured, "it is being aimed." Martin looked at her. Could that happen remotely? With the right access, yes. And the system would log it. It should. But, Clara tapped the screenshot. If Peter had to capture these manually, then the official logs may not preserve the adjustment. Or they may describe it as calibration. She looked again at the 3 letters beside the cove. UDZ, underwater drop zone. The phrase arrived in her mind with such clarity that she did not speak it aloud at first. It felt too large for the room, too modern for the old paper and curled charts around them. But once it was there, other things began attaching themselves to it. The offshore vessel whose signal degraded but did not vanish, the cove usable only at slack tide, the 4-minute blind spot, the dark shape in the water, the lighthouse angle shifting by a fraction no ordinary archive reviewer would notice. "Clara," Martin said. She folded the map open fully and weighed the corners down with 2 brass rulers. "Do you still have the raw import drives from the early automation phase?" He blinked. "Possibly. Why?" "The archive footage may have been altered after import. Peter might have seen something before the system normalized it. If the drives still exist, there'll be an off-site storage." "How far?" "Camborne. We use a records facility there." Clara looked up sharply. A drive, physical media, something removed from the live system. Something that might contain older data before later corrections and substitutions. The thought steadied her. A hidden record was different from a suspicion. It could be examined, copied, compared. Martin seemed to follow her reasoning and grimaced. "I can request retrieval. Do it without saying Blackrock." He nodded slowly. The instruction frightened him, which was precisely why he obeyed it. Clara photographed Peter's notes with her phone, then hesitated. The phone was connected to the network. Cloud backups, metadata, silent conveniences that had once seemed harmless. She turned off automatic syncing and switched the device to airplane mode before continuing. It was an imperfect precaution, but fear had begun teaching her a new kind of literacy. She placed the original pages back inside the envelope. Martin said, "You should take them." "No, you need them. And if someone already knows I came here, they may assume I took something." Clara slid the envelope beneath a stack of unrelated correspondence. Not where it had been, but not in plain view either. "Keep the originals here for now. If anything happens, you can still produce them." Martin's face changed at the words, "anything happens." "Clara, this is moving very quickly." "It's been moving for 4 years." He had no answer to that. Before leaving the map room, Clara asked to see the early contractor files. Martin brought 2 folders from the same box. Most of the documents were routine: procurement forms, installation schedules, equipment warranties, access agreements written in dense administrative language. Clara scanned them quickly, searching not for what the forms said, but for names, dates, irregular attachments, anything that might connect the technical pattern to people. A name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Hart, Systems Liaison, Remote Access Coordinator, Contractor Contact for Archive Compatibility. The same Daniel Hart who had called Clara's landline. She copied his name into her notebook. Beneath it she wrote, KMS access before loops, asked if report being prepared. A second name appeared on field inspection forms. Owen Merrick, senior marine electrical technician. His signature was heavy, angular, impatient. He had signed off early camera alignments, lantern motor tests, and a cliffside access survey completed during the first automation year. On one form, he had noted restricted physical access due to unstable ground. On another, he had requested a private key for the service gate on the old Coast Guard track. Clara turned the page. The next document had been photocopied badly. A site risk assessment, wind exposure, cliff erosion, limited mobile signal, emergency evacuation route. At the bottom, someone had added a handwritten note beside the section marked night operations. No unscheduled visits without KMS escort. She looked at the phrase for a long time. Was that normal? She asked. Martin adjusted his glasses and read over her shoulder. For an active maintenance site, perhaps. For a sealed automated lighthouse. He did not finish. By the time Clara left the trust, rain had eased to a fine mist. The harbour lay beyond the buildings, pale and restless under a low sky. Masts clinked softly in the wind. A few tourists moved along the pavement with hoods up, carrying paper cups, unaware that the town around them had shifted in Clara's mind from refuge to exposure. She kept her head down as she crossed to the car. The walk was shorter than she feared and longer than she could bear. Each step stretched. Every parked vehicle seemed occupied until she passed it. Every reflection in a shop window looked like someone turning toward her. When she reached the car, her hands shook badly enough that she dropped the keys beneath the door. She crouched to retrieve them. That was when she noticed the smear of mud on the lower panel. Not road spray, not random dirt. 3 finger marks dragged lightly through the grime near the handle. Someone had touched the car while she was inside. Clara stood slowly and looked around the car park. Nothing obvious. A delivery driver unloading boxes. A couple arguing softly near the ticket machine. A white van parked 2 rows away with no company marking on its side. Its windscreen reflected the grey sky, hiding the interior. Clara got into her car and locked the doors. For a full minute, she did not start the engine. The white van did not move. She drove out carefully, forcing herself not to look as though she was fleeing. Through the rear-view mirror, the van remained where it was. At the first roundabout, no vehicle followed. At the second, a blue hatchback turned behind her, then disappeared toward Penryn. By the time the road opened beyond town, Clara had almost convinced herself the marks on the car meant nothing. Almost. Back at the cottage, she parked close to the wall and remained seated with the engine off. The house looked unchanged. Low roof, whitewashed walls, smoke stain above the chimney, garden bent by weather. Curtains exactly as she had left them, but the front gate was open. Clara had closed it that morning, she was certain. She sat still, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The lane behind her was empty. Wind moved through the hedges. Somewhere above the fields, gulls cried with that harsh, laughing sound that had always made the coast feel older than human worry. She took out her phone, then remembered it was still in airplane mode. The sensible thing would have been to drive away, to call Martin, to call the police, to do anything except walk toward a house that might no longer be empty. But the external drive was beneath the study floorboard. Her main data was inside. Clara stepped out of the car. The cottage door was locked. The windows were intact. She opened the door and called Bosun's name, quietly at first, then louder. No answer. The hallway smelled different, not strongly, not enough that anyone else might have noticed. But Clara lived inside small rooms and familiar air. She knew the smell of her cottage: paper, damp stone, tea, old wood, and cat. Now there was something else beneath it. Cold rain on waterproof fabric. She moved through the hall into the kitchen. Nothing disturbed. The study door stood half open. She had left it closed. Clara's throat tightened. She pushed the door with 2 fingers. The study looked almost exactly as she had left it. Bookshelves, monitor asleep, papers aligned beside the keyboard. The biscuit tin beneath the old ledgers still in place. The rug slightly rucked near the radiator. Bosun emerged from under the desk, low to the floor, tail puffed, eyes wide. Clara crouched and whispered his name. The cat did not come to her. He stared instead at the window. On the glass, faint but visible in the dampness, someone had drawn a circle with one finger. Inside the circle were 3 letters, UDZ. For several seconds, Clara did not breathe. The letters on the window were not deeply marked. They had been drawn through condensation or through the thin salt film that gathered on the glass when the wind came hard from the sea. Already, the edges of the strokes were beginning to soften. UDZ. 3 simple letters inside a circle, made by someone who had stood close enough to the cottage to see into the room where she worked, slept badly, and tried to keep the world at a distance. Bosun remained under the desk, eyes fixed on the window. Clara moved toward it slowly. Not because she believed the person was still outside, but because her body had forgotten how to move quickly. The garden beyond the glass was empty. Rowan branches shivered in the wind. The low wall, the wet grass, the narrow track beyond the Kent, all familiar, all altered. There was no footprint obvious from where she stood, no face retreating into the hedges, no van waiting at the bend. Only the mark, UDZ, underwater drop zone. She had not spoken those words aloud at the trust. She had not typed them into the archive system. She had only thought them, formed them silently while looking at Peter Lanyon's map. Yet here they were, drawn on her own window, as if whoever entered the cottage had wanted her to know that the distance between her thoughts and their knowledge was smaller than she believed. Her first impulse was to wipe the glass. It was almost overwhelming. Remove it, erase it, restore the room, make the house ordinary again. She even lifted her sleeve toward the pane before stopping herself. Records Clara. That was Martin's voice in her memory, or perhaps her own, made firmer by habit. Records first. She took out her phone, turned off airplane mode, then hesitated before reconnecting fully. The device seemed less like protection now than a hole in her pocket. She switched the camera on without enabling the network and photographed the window from 3 distances. Wide shot with desk, medium shot with frame, close shot of the circle and letters. Then she moved outside through the kitchen door, keeping her keys between her fingers in the useless way people do when fear wants an object. The air was colder than it had been an hour earlier. Mist hung low in the lane. The grass near the study window was wet enough to hold impressions, but the ground beneath the sill was gravel. Whoever had stood there had chosen the one place where footprints would not remain cleanly. Clara crouched anyway and saw 3 displaced stones, a darker scuff near the wall, and a thread of black fabric caught on the thorn of a gooseberry bush. She photographed that too. A sensible person would have called the police. Clara stood in the garden with the phone in her hand and imagined the conversation. Someone entered my cottage, or perhaps only stood outside. They wrote 3 letters on my window. The letters may refer to a theory I have about altered lighthouse footage, contractor access logs, untracked vessels, and a hidden maritime route beneath Blackrock Point. She could hear how it would sound. Not impossible. Not laughable, perhaps, but fragile. Dependent on context, no officer taking a first call would have time to absorb. And if she handed over too much too soon, the wrong local contact, the wrong casual phone call, the wrong inquiry sent to the wrong contractor could alert the very people she now believed were watching her. Still, there had been an intrusion. She called Martin. He answered almost at once. Clara? His voice contained the fear of a man who had spent the last hour waiting for news he did not want. Someone was at the cottage, she said. The line went quiet. Inside? I'm not sure. The study door was open. There's a mark on the window. The letters from Peter's map. UDZ? Yes. Martin swore softly, something she had rarely heard from him. Leave, he said. Go to your sister's. Go anywhere. Clara looked toward the cottage. From the garden, the house seemed smaller than it felt from within. A low, old building holding her books, her work, her fear, her routines, the carefully maintained evidence of a life made survivable. Leave, he said, as if safety were waiting elsewhere, rather than dissolving the moment she stepped beyond the walls. I need the drive, she said. Get it and leave. And go where? If someone knows enough to come here, they may know where my sister lives. Then call the police. I will, but not with half a story. Clara, listen to yourself. She closed her eyes. He was right. She knew how this sounded. A woman with a history of anxiety refusing the most obvious help because the conspiracy was too delicate to trust to ordinary channels. That was exactly how fear corrupted judgment. It made every reasonable path appear compromised. It could trap a person inside logic that looked precise and was, in fact, panic-wearing spectacles. But the mark was real. Peter's warning was real. The call from Daniel Hart was real. And the data was real. "I need you to request the early import drives from storage," Clara said. "I already did." She opened her eyes. "When?" "After you left. I used a generic retrieval code for automation material. They said it might be delivered tomorrow morning." "Might be?" "The facility has staffing issues, but yes, tomorrow with luck." Clara looked down the lane, empty. Wet hedges. No movement. "Do not mention Blackrock to anyone," she said. "I haven't. And if anyone from Kerno calls, I'll say the request concerns exhibition material." There was a pause. Then Martin said more quietly, "Clara, did you ever hear what happened to Peter Lanyon after he left?" "You said he moved away." "That's what I told myself. I've just searched old emails. His last message to me wasn't from his usual account. It was sent from a library computer in Truro." Clara's grip tightened on the phone. "What did it say?" "Only one line." Martin breathed once, unsteadily. "It said, if they ask, I deleted everything." The wind moved across the garden with a soft rush, bending the wet grass. Clara looked again at the thread of black fabric on the thorn bush. Not proof. Not enough. But something. A trace left by a person who had come too close. "I'll call you back," she said. "Clara." She ended the call before he could ask her to be sensible again. Inside, she moved through the cottage room by room, photographing without touching more than necessary. Kitchen, hallway, study, back door, window latch, desk drawers. The drawers had not been forced. Her computer remained where it was. The biscuit tin still sat beneath the ledgers. The person had either found nothing, taken nothing, or wanted her to believe both. She knelt by the floorboard beneath the study rug and lifted it with the end of a letter opener. The external drive was still there, wrapped in a faded tea towel. She stared at it for a long moment before taking it out. If they had entered the cottage, why leave the drive? There were several possible answers, none comforting. They might not have known where it was. They might not have had time. They might have copied it already. Or they might have wanted her to keep carrying the evidence, because frightened people moving with evidence could be followed. Clara connected the drive to an offline laptop she kept for legacy media review. The files opened. The spreadsheet was there. The script outputs. The copied footage samples. Peter's photographed notes had not been added yet, but the core data remained intact. She made another copy. Then another. One onto a small card she sealed inside an envelope marked Family Photos 2012. One onto an older USB stick she taped beneath a drawer. The original drive went into her handbag. She was not sure whether this was clever or absurd. Her mind had begun splitting every action into two versions. What an investigator would do, and what a frightened amateur in a cottage would imagine an investigator doing. At 4:17 p.m., her internet failed. The screen did not go black dramatically. No warning flashed. The archive browser simply stopped loading. Her email froze halfway through syncing. The router in the corner blinked amber, then red, then settled into a steady, accusing light. Clara reset it. Nothing. She checked the phone line. Dead. The cottage became instantly older. Without the low, invisible hum of connection, its walls seemed thicker, the lane more remote, the sea closer. Clara stood beside the router, listening to the silence where modern life should have been. Then she walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the pole where the line crossed from the lane to the cottage. The cable hung lower than usual, not fully severed but damaged. A dark, loose curve against the grey sky, moving slightly in the wind. Her mobile still showed one weak bar. She tried Martin. The call failed. She tried again from the back doorway, holding the phone up like an offering to the weather. This time it rang twice before dropping. She typed a message instead. Line cut, internet down, keeping data offline. Do not email details. Await drives. The message sat unsent for nearly a minute before the signal caught and released it. A reply did not come. By late afternoon, the light had begun to thin. Clara moved around the cottage closing curtains, though each one she drew made the rooms feel more enclosed. She placed a chair beneath the front door handle, then felt foolish and left it there anyway. She checked the back lock twice. She filled the kettle, several bottles, and a saucepan with water, because some old part of her believed preparation mattered even when she did not know what she was preparing for. As SIG headlights appeared on the lane. They came slowly, too slowly for a neighbor returning home, too carefully for a lost tourist. Clara saw them through the narrow gap in the kitchen curtains, two white beams moving over the hedge, pausing near the gate, then cutting out. She turned off the kitchen light. The cottage fell into shadow. A vehicle door opened outside, then another. No one knocked. For a while, there was only wind, rain beginning again, and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Clara stood in the dark, with her phone in one hand and the external drive in the other, feeling the old panic rise behind her ribs, huge and familiar. This was the nightmare shape of the world after London. Unseen people outside, no clear exit, the body convinced that stillness was survival. Then a voice came from beyond the front door. Miss Evans, male, calm, local accent, sanded smooth at the edges. Daniel Hart, we know you're in there. We only want to talk. Clara did not move. Another voice, lower, muttered something she could not catch. Daniel spoke again, closer to the door this time. There's been a misunderstanding about the Blackrock files. You've accessed material outside your remit. That creates liability for you and for the trust. The word liability sounded almost bureaucratic, almost normal. Clara could imagine him in a clean office, explaining permissions and compliance, not standing outside a dark cottage at the end of a wet Cornish lane after her phone line had been cut. Her mobile showed no service. Daniel continued, voice gentle enough to be insulting. Open the door, Clara. Let's make this simple. Bosun slipped beneath the kitchen table and disappeared into shadow. Clara backed away from the hall, one careful step at a time. The rear door led to the garden, then the low wall, then the fields beyond. Open ground, darkness, no shelter, everything her body feared. At the front of the cottage, something touched the door handle. Not a knock, a test. Clara looked toward the back door. For years, she had built her life around not crossing thresholds unless she had to. Now the threshold waited in front of her, black glass, cold handle, wet night beyond it. And from the hallway came the soft scrape of metal against the lock. The sound at the front door was quiet enough that Clara almost convinced herself she had imagined it. A thin, metallic scrape, a pause, then another. Not the blunt force of someone trying to break in, but the patient work of someone who believed time belonged to him. It was a careful sound, almost intimate, and that made it worse. Violence would have given her permission to panic. This required thought. Clara stood in the kitchen darkness with the external drive pressed against her palm. The back door was 3 steps away. Beyond it waited the garden, the low wall, the wet field, the open night. Her body understood those things not as geography, but as threat. The open air meant exposure. The field meant no handrail, no corridor, no controlled distance between herself and whatever moved under the sky. For years she had chosen walls, familiar rooms, windows that could be closed, screens that allowed her to observe without being seen. Now the house itself had become the trap. At the front, Daniel Hart spoke again. Clara, I need you to listen carefully. Nobody wants this to become unpleasant. The phrase landed with terrible softness. Nobody wants this. As if what happened next would be partly her fault. The lock clicked once, not opening, but shifting under pressure. The chair beneath the handle gave a faint wooden groan. Clara's throat tightened. She moved to the back door and slid the bolt aside as slowly as she could, wincing at the tiny sound. Rain tapped against the glass. She turned the key. For a moment, her hand would not pull the door open. It remembered other thresholds. The station concourse in London. The crowd tightening, the air leaving her lungs, the sense that the world had become too large and too close at the same time. She felt it now, as if the past had stepped into the kitchen and put its hands around her ribs. Then the front door handle moved again. Clara opened the back door and stepped into the rain. Cold struck her face. The garden was almost black, the shapes of shrubs and the low wall blurred by mist. She moved without switching on the outside light, following memory more than sight. 3 steps to the flagstone, 4 to the edge of the herb bed, 6 to the gap in the wall. She had crossed this garden hundreds of times in daylight, but in the dark it felt unfamiliar, a place rearranged by weather and fear. Behind her, the kitchen remained unlit. At the front of the cottage, Daniel's voice sharpened. "Clara!" He had heard something. She reached the low wall and climbed awkwardly over it, one boot slipping on wet stone. Her knee struck the top hard enough to send pain up her thigh, but she did not cry out. The field beyond sloped gently toward the hedgerow and the narrow farm track that curved behind the cottage. The grass soaked her boots almost at once. She had no plan beyond distance. That was the first thing fear took from her, the ability to imagine more than the next few yards. She moved hunched against the rain, handbag clutched to her side, the external drive inside it now heavy as a confession. Wind pushed at her coat. Somewhere to her left, beyond the fields, the sea boomed against the cliffs with a sound too deep to belong to weather alone. A light came on behind her, not from the cottage. A torch. It swept across the garden, caught the rowan tree, the wet wall, the empty patch where she had climbed over, then moved toward the field. Clara dropped to the ground behind a low rise of grass. The cold went through her trousers immediately. Mud pressed against one hand. She lay still, breath loud in her ears, while the torch beam passed above her and moved on. Voices carried through the rain. She went out the back. "Find her," Daniel's voice remained controlled. No shouting. No neighbors. No neighbors. The words had a practical cruelty to them. They knew exactly where she lived. They knew exactly how alone the cottage was. Clara crawled several feet toward the hedgerow before forcing herself upright. The farm track was closer now, a darker strip between two banks of bramble and gorse. If she reached it, she could follow it toward the old chapel road. From there, perhaps the village, perhaps a house with lights, perhaps a phone. Her mobile showed no service. She slipped it into her pocket and kept moving. The hedge scratched her coat as she entered the track. Rain collected in the ruts, shining faintly when lightning flickered far out to sea. Her breath came too quickly. She tried to slow it, counting as she had been taught. 4 in, hold, 6 out. But the numbers scattered. Behind her, another torch beam cut through the field. Then, from somewhere ahead, a woman's voice whispered, "Down!" Clara froze. A figure stepped from the hedgerow so suddenly, Clara nearly screamed. A hand reached out, not grabbing, but firm enough to guide her into the shadow beneath an overgrown blackthorn. "Quiet," the woman said. She was older than Clara, perhaps in her early 60s, with a weatherproof coat pulled tight at the hood and a face made sharp by rain and darkness. In one hand she held a small torch covered with red tape to dull the light. In the other, astonishingly, she held a pair of binoculars. Clara tried to pull away. "I'm not with them," the woman whispered. The torch beam behind them swept across the track entrance. Both women crouched lower. Clara could hear footsteps in the field now, slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" Clara breathed. "Margaret Lanyon." The name moved through Clara like a struck match. Peter. The woman seemed to read her recognition. His sister. There was no time to ask how she had found Clara, why she was there, or whether this was another layer of the trap. Margaret touched Clara's sleeve and pointed down the track. "My car's not far. We need to go before they spread out." Clara hesitated. Trust had become a dangerous currency. Daniel Hart had used her name gently through a locked door. Peter had warned Martin and then vanished into silence. Someone had drawn the secret letters on Clara's window. Now a woman appeared in the rain, claiming to be connected to the one person who had noticed the pattern before Clara did. Margaret's expression hardened. "If I wanted to hand you to them, I'd have shouted already." It was not comforting exactly, but it was logical. Clara followed. They moved along the farm track with painful slowness, keeping to the hedge whenever headlights or torchlight shifted behind them. Margaret knew the ground. She avoided puddles that looked shallow but were not, guided Clara around a collapsed section of bank, and once pulled her down behind a stone trough as a vehicle engine started near the cottage. Through a gap in the hedge, Clara saw the front of her home. The unmarked van had moved closer to the gate. 2 men stood near it. Daniel Hart was one of them, his face briefly lit by the glow of a phone. He looked less like a predator than a professional disappointed by inefficiency. That unsettled Clara more than anger would have. Margaret leaned close. "Don't look at them too long." "Why are you here?" Clara whispered. Because you found the same thing Peter found. How do you know that? Margaret's mouth tightened. Because someone called my house this afternoon asking whether my brother had left any research material with me. They used his full name. People stopped using his full name after he died. Clara nearly stumbled. Died? Margaret turned sharply. You didn't know? No, Martin said he moved away. He did, for 6 weeks. The words were flat, controlled by long practice. Then he came back, frightened, thinner, and suddenly very certain he had made a terrible mistake. 2 months later, he was found on the beach below Trevellas after a winter storm. Clara stopped despite the danger. Margaret took her arm. Not here. What happened? The inquest said misadventure. He liked walking the cliffs. The weather was poor, the path was unstable. All true enough. But you don't believe it. I believe my brother knew every dangerous foot of that coast and avoided it in bad weather. The vehicle near Clara's cottage started moving. Its headlights swept across the field, briefly turning rain into silver wires. Margaret pulled Clara into motion again. They reached a narrow lane, concealed behind a line of wind-bent pines. An old green Subaru waited with its lights off, nose pointed downhill. Margaret unlocked it manually, rather than using the remote. Clara slid into the passenger seat, shaking with cold, adrenaline, and the effort of not collapsing into herself. Inside the car smelled of wet wool, dog hair, and peppermint sweets. Margaret started the engine without headlights and rolled the car forward in neutral until the lane curved behind a hedge. Only then did she switch on the dipped beams. Seatbelt, she said. Clara obeyed automatically. The lane descended between high hedges, water running down the tarmac in thin streams. Behind them, the van's engine grew louder, then faded as it took a different road. For the first time since leaving the cottage, Clara allowed herself to exhale fully. Margaret drove like someone who had spent decades on Cornish backroads and trusted none of them. She did not speed. She did not brake suddenly. She took turns with the steady confidence of local knowledge, using lanes Clara would never have chosen because they looked too narrow to lead anywhere useful. After several minutes, Clara found her voice. How did you know where I lived? Peter kept copies of his correspondence. Martin's name was in them. Yours appeared in a trust newsletter after you took over digital records. When the call came today, I searched you and came to my house. I went to the trust first, saw a man watching the side entrance from a white van. Then I drove to your cottage. I arrived after they did. Clara looked at her. Margaret kept her eyes on the road. I saw one of them by your window. The letters on the glass seemed to reappear in Clara's mind, wet and deliberate. Did you see his face? No. Hood up, tall, broad, not hard. Owen Merrick, Clara said softly. Margaret glanced at her. You have names? Some. Good. Names matter. They drove in silence for a while. The rain thickened, drumming on the roof. Clara watched the hedgerows pass close to the windows, dark and wet, opening occasionally onto glimpses of fields and distant black water. Her fear had not gone. It had changed texture. Inside the cottage, fear had been a room with no exit. Here, in a moving car beside a stranger, it became something sharper and more alert. Where are we going? Clara asked. My place first. Not for long. Why not? Because if they called me, they know enough to find me. Clara turned toward her. Then why help me? Margaret's hands tightened briefly on the wheel. Because Peter spent his last weeks trying to decide whether being alive was worth more than being believed. He chose alive, or thought he did. It didn't save him. The words settled heavily between them. Clara looked down at her handbag. The drive was still inside. All the data she had gathered, all the patterns that had pulled her from the safe fiction of her work, sat in a plastic rectangle beside her gloves and house keys. What did Peter think was coming ashore? She asked. Margaret did not answer at once. The car climbed a hill. At the top, the road opened briefly to the coast. Far below, the Atlantic was a moving darkness, broken by lines of white foam. Somewhere beyond the headland, unseen from the road, Blackrock Point would be turning its automated light across the water. Not drugs, Margaret said finally. Not at the end. Clara felt the air inside the car tighten. What then? My brother found a recording. Audio, not video. He said it came from a maintenance microphone that was never meant to save anything. He played me 20 seconds of it, then regretted it immediately. Clara waited. Rain hammered the windscreen. The wipers dragged back and forth, clearing and losing the road, clearing and losing it again. Margaret's voice lowered. There were people inside whatever came up from the water. Not crew, not contractors. The road curved suddenly, and headlights appeared ahead. A vehicle blocked the lane. Margaret braked hard. For one suspended second, the two cars faced each other in the rain, beams locked, engines running, no room to pass. Then the driver's door of the other vehicle opened. The other vehicle sat across the lane like a god. Its headlights filled the Subaru with hard white light, flattening Margaret Lanyon's face into angles and shadow. Rain beat against the windscreen. The wipers moved once, dragging water aside just long enough for Clara to see the shape of the car ahead. Dark estate, wide bonnet, no visible markings, mud along the wheel arches. It had not broken down. It had been placed there. The driver's door opened. For a second, no one emerged. Only one boot appeared on the wet road, then the rest of the man unfolded into the rain. He wore a dark waterproof jacket with the hood pulled low, but the build was unmistakable from Peter's old files and from the name Clara had written into her notebook only hours earlier. Owen Merrick. He was taller than Daniel Hart, heavier through the shoulders, with the practical stillness of someone accustomed to working outdoors in bad weather. He did not hurry, he did not shout. He stood beside the open door and raised one hand, palm down, making a small calming motion as if he had come across two nervous animals on a country road. Margaret's breathing changed. "Do not open your door," she said. Clara's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. "Is there another way out? Not without reversing half a mile. Can you? In this rain? On this lane?" Margaret's eyes flicked to the mirror. Not fast enough. Behind them, the road curved into darkness. Ahead, Merrick remained in the headlights, face still hidden beneath the hood. The lane was too narrow for either car to pass. High hedges rose on both sides, black and dripping, packed tight with bramble and stone. It was the sort of Cornish road that locals navigated by instinct and visitors entered only once before swearing never again. Merrick stepped forward. Margaret lowered the driver's window 2 inches. Cold rain immediately sprayed in. "That's far enough," she called. Merrick stopped. His voice, when it came, was low and rougher than Daniel Hart's carefully polished tone. "Mrs. Lanyon." "Miss," Margaret said, "Peter was my brother, not my husband." "Right." Merrick tilted his head. "Sorry." The apology was so inappropriate, so neatly placed, that Clara felt a pulse of anger beneath her fear. He knew exactly who Margaret was. He had used the wrong title not by accident, but to show how easily he could reduce people to entries on a list. Merrick's gaze shifted toward the passenger seat. Clara could not see his eyes, but she felt the attention settle on her. "Miss Evans," he said, "you shouldn't be out in this weather." Margaret gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You blocked a lane to discuss the forecast?" "No, I'm trying to stop this becoming worse than it needs to be." "There it is again," Clara said before she could stop herself. Merrick leaned slightly, as if hearing her for the first time. "What's that?" "That sentence." "You people keep using it." For a moment, the rain was the only sound. Merrick's mouth moved into something too small to be called a smile. "You people." Margaret's hand slid toward the gear stick. Clara saw it and understood a second too late. The Subaru lurched backward. Merrick moved at once, but not toward them. He lifted his arm, and the headlights behind Clara flared in the rearview mirror. Another vehicle. It had rolled quietly into place behind them, lights off until that moment. The lane behind was no longer empty. The Subaru stopped with a wet skid, boxed between the estate car ahead and a van behind. Margaret swore under her breath a single precise word. Clara's chest tightened. The old panic surged, not as memory now, but as immediate fact. Trapped front and back, no exit, too little air. Merrick walked closer. "Switch off the engine," he said. Margaret did not move. "I said switch it off." The van behind them opened one door. Clara turned and saw only a silhouette stepping into the rain. Daniel Hart. Of course. His figure was slimmer than Merrick's, his posture straighter. Even in the downpour, he seemed careful not to hurry. Clara had the strange impression that if he could have carried an umbrella without looking ridiculous, he would have. Margaret looked at Clara. Whatever happens, don't give them the drive. The handbag sat between Clara's feet. The drive was inside, but so was the smaller memory stick from the trust, the one with the subset of data. The original full drive remained beneath the floorboard at the cottage no longer, because she had taken it. Copies existed, but she did not know whether any of them would survive if these men reached her house again. For one terrible moment, she saw the whole investigation reduced to a handful of plastic devices, each absurdly fragile, each easier to destroy than a match. Adsi. Daniel Hart came up beside Clara's window and tapped once with a gloved finger. Not hard, almost politely. "Clara," he said through the glass, "open the door." She stared ahead. "This is not what you think," he continued. "You found irregularities in a restricted maritime security system. That does not mean you understand them." Margaret said, "Then explain them." Daniel looked past Clara toward her. "You already had your chance to stay out of this, Margaret." The use of her first name changed something in the car. Clara saw it in the older woman's face. Not surprise, but confirmation. "You were there," Margaret said. Daniel's expression did not shift. "At Peter's house," she said, "after Martin called him." Daniel's silence answered before his words did. "Peter was distressed," he said. "He had misunderstood a technical matter and was at risk of spreading damaging allegations. He was frightened of you. He was frightened of shadows." Margaret laughed again, but this time it broke at the edge. "And then he fell off a cliff." Daniel's face hardened just enough for Clara to see the man beneath the professional coating. "Your brother's death was investigated by people who never heard the recording." There was a pause. Merrick, standing in front of the car, shifted his weight. Daniel turned his head slightly toward him, then back to Clara's window. The movement was small, but Clara saw it. So did Margaret. The recording mattered. Whatever Peter had captured in those 20 seconds was not a grief-stricken invention. It had touched something they still feared. "What recording?" Clara asked quietly. Daniel ignored the question. "We need the files you downloaded." "No," Margaret said. Daniel kept his eyes on Clara. "You are a records manager. You know what happens when incomplete data is taken out of context. People build stories. They ruin lives. They interfere with operations that exist for reasons they cannot be told." "Operations," Clara repeated. He seemed to regret the word even as it left him. Merrick stepped closer to the bonnet. "Enough." Daniel raised a hand slightly, not looking at him. "No. She needs to understand." For the first time, Clara sensed a fracture between them. Merrick wanted the problem removed. Daniel wanted it contained. Both were dangerous, but not in the same way. Daniel leaned nearer the glass. Rain ran from his hood onto his collar. The Blackrock system is part of a broader coastal monitoring arrangement. Some of its functions are not public. If you disclose altered footage without context, you will compromise matters far beyond your employment. Clara listened carefully, not to the surface of the words, but to their shape. It sounded like authority. It sounded like the kind of sentence designed to make civilians step back, embarrassed by their ignorance. Restricted. Broader arrangement. Not public. Compromise. It had the rhythm of official secrecy. And that was exactly what she had been afraid of. Not smugglers. Not only smugglers. Something larger. Something perhaps entangled with legitimate systems or pretending to be. Margaret's voice cut through her thoughts. "Ask him about the people in the water." Daniel's eyes flickered. Clara saw it. "What people?" she said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "There are no people." "Then why did Peter's audio frighten you?" Margaret said. "Because Peter was unstable. He was an engineer. He was an elderly man with an obsession." Margaret's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Say one more word about him like that." Merrick moved toward the driver's door. "We're done." Clara's mind sharpened suddenly, not because fear disappeared, but because it had finally found a task. Daniel had made a mistake. He had not denied the system was altered. He had not called the loops imaginary. He had framed them as restricted, protected, contextual. That meant the apparent explanation she had been building all day was incomplete. The 4-minute blind spot was not just a hiding place exploited by criminals. It might be a designed corridor inside official infrastructure, maintained under the cover of security, then repurposed, sold, or quietly captured by the very people contracted to service it. The horror was not that the cameras had failed. The horror was that the cameras had obeyed. And if Peter had discovered people inside whatever surfaced at Blackrock, then the blind spot was not only moving contraband through darkness, it was moving human beings. Clara reached down slowly toward her handbag. Daniel saw the movement. Clara, she opened the bag, keeping her eyes on him, and took out the smaller memory stick. Not the full drive, the ordinary one. The decoy, though she had not thought of it that way until now, Daniel's gaze dropped to it. "This is what you want?" she said. Margaret turned sharply. "Clara, it's the data from the trust," Clara said. Her voice sounded unfamiliar to her, steady in a way she did not feel. "The Blackrock anomaly exports, contractor logs, tide overlaps, enough to make your life difficult." Daniel held out his hand. "Give it to me, and we can all go home." Merrick reached the driver's side. His hand closed around Margaret's door handle. Clara looked at Daniel. "You first." He frowned. "What?" "Tell me what UDZ means." "Clara, this is not a negotiation." "Then you don't get it." For a second, something like admiration passed through his expression, or perhaps she imagined it because she needed him to be human. Merrick pulled Margaret's door open. The older woman moved faster than Clara expected. She slammed her shoulder into the door from inside, striking Merrick's arm and forcing him back half a step. At the same moment, Clara threw the memory stick through the narrow gap at the top of her partially lowered window. Daniel instinctively reached for it. Margaret hit the accelerator. The Subaru surged forward. Merrick shouted. The estate car ahead was still blocking most of the lane, but Margaret did not aim for the road. She drove toward the hedge. Branches exploded across the windscreen. The car mounted the verge, tilted violently, scraped against stone hidden beneath the bramble, and forced itself through a gap that did not look large enough to accept it. Clara struck the door with her shoulder and cried out despite herself. The headlights caught leaves, rain, the pale underside of branches, then open darkness. For several seconds, there was no road at all. Only mud, grass, and the terrifying slide of tires searching for grip. Then the Subaru dropped onto another track with a crash that snapped Clara's teeth together. Margaret kept driving. Behind them, voices shouted. An engine roared, but the hedge they had broken through closed the line of sight, and the track they were on dipped sharply between old stone banks. Clara twisted in her seat. "Did you see where the memory stick went?" Margaret gave a breathless, incredulous laugh. "That is what you're worried about? It wasn't the full drive." Margaret glanced at her, rain and mud streaking the windscreen between them. "Good." Clara looked down at her handbag. The full external drive remained inside. Her hands began to shake only then, violently, as if her body had waited for permission. The Subaru bounced along the track, branches scraping both sides. Margaret drove without headlights for several hundred yards, then switched them on briefly at a bend before killing them again. The car smelled of torn leaves and overheated engine. "Where does this lead?" Clara asked. "Old Quarry Road, then Trevelyan Farm if the gate isn't locked." "If it is." "We improvise." Improvisation had never been Clara's strength. Her world depended on order, indexed records, verified dates, clear file paths. Yet everything important now seemed to exist in the spaces between systems. A blind spot in a lighthouse feed, a missing recording, a dead engineer's warning, an unofficial corridor through the sea. Margaret drove another mile before pulling behind a derelict stone barn and cutting the engine. The sudden silence was immense. Rain ticked on the roof. Somewhere nearby, water ran through a ditch. Clara listened for engines and heard none. Margaret leaned forward over the wheel, breathing hard. For a moment, her age returned to her face. Not weakness, but the cost of forcing herself through fear for too many years. "Peter said one more thing about the audio," she said. Clara turned toward her. "He said there was a voice speaking English." "Whose voice?" "Not crew, not frightened passengers, someone giving instructions." Margaret swallowed. "He said it sounded like a child being told to stay quiet." The rain seemed to fade around them. Clara looked out through the blurred windscreen toward the invisible coast, toward Blackrock Point, toward the lighthouse that had been taught to look away every 72 hours. Until that moment, part of her had still hoped the explanation might remain technical, criminal, containable. Now the shape of the mystery changed completely. The blind spot was not hiding what came ashore. It was hiding who? For a while, neither woman spoke. The old stone barn crouched beside the quarry road like something abandoned by a harder century. Its roof had partly collapsed at one end, and through the broken slates, rain fell in slow, uneven taps onto the darkness within. The Subaru sat behind it with its engine off, hidden from the lane by a wall of bramble and nettle gone black in the weather. Mist pressed close to the windows. Beyond it, the night held the coast in silence. Clara Evans sat in the passenger seat with the external drive in her handbag, and the sound of Margaret's last words lodged somewhere beneath her ribs. A child being told to stay quiet. There were phrases the mind resisted. It did not refuse them completely. It held them at a distance, as if language itself might become contaminated if allowed too near. Clara had spent years cataloguing wreck records, inquest notes, Coast Guard statements, and letters written by men who knew they might not come home from the sea. She was not naive about loss. But there was a particular coldness in the thought of a child inside some hidden maritime route, beneath a lighthouse beam redirected by software, behind 4 minutes of carefully manufactured darkness. That was no longer a technical irregularity. It was a moral event. Margaret Lanyon's hands remained on the steering wheel, though there was nowhere to drive yet. Her knuckles were pale. Rainwater ran from her sleeves onto the faded fabric of the seat. She looked not frightened now, but emptied, as though speaking Peter's memory aloud had cost her something she had been preserving for years. Clara turned toward her. Why didn't Peter go to the police? Margaret did not answer at once. Outside, the wind moved through the brambles with a soft dragging sound. He tried, she said finally. Clara felt a small, hopeless tightening in her chest. What happened? He never told me everything. Peter was careful after the visit to his house. Too careful. He stopped using his normal phone. He started walking to places instead of driving. He wrote things down and then burned the paper in the back garden. It was like watching a man turn his own life into evidence and then become terrified of who might read it. She looked through the windscreen, though there was nothing to see but rain. One evening, he came to me with an old dictaphone, not his usual one. This little grey thing he used when he was checking wiring in lofts or engine rooms. He said he had captured audio during a maintenance test from Blackrock. He said the microphone should not have recorded continuously, but some devices buffer sound before transmitting diagnostics. He believed he had recovered a fragment from the system cache. Clara listened carefully. Technical uncertainty mattered. It was not enough to say Peter found proof. She had to understand what kind of proof, how fragile, how contestable, how easily someone like Daniel Hart could dismiss it as noise, stress, misinterpretation. He played it for you. Only once. What did you hear? Margaret closed her eyes. Water first, metal, something hollow, maybe a hatch, a man breathing hard. Then a voice close to the microphone saying, "Keep them low." Another voice said, "Light in 90 seconds." Then there was a sound I thought was an animal at first. Clara waited. But Peter stopped the recording and said, "No, listen." So he played that part again. It wasn't an animal. It was someone crying without wanting to be heard. A car passed somewhere far away on a higher road, the sound rising and fading through the wet dark. Clara instinctively lowered her head, though no headlights reached them. "And the child?" she asked. The final seconds. A woman's voice, very sharp, whispering in English. "Stay quiet. Please, stay quiet." Then a man said something I couldn't understand. After that, the recording cut out. Clara swallowed. Did Peter keep the dictaphone? He said he hid it. Where? I don't know. Margaret's jaw tightened. He wouldn't tell me. He thought keeping me ignorant would keep me safe. The bitterness in her voice was old and still alive. Clara looked down at her handbag. Did they know about the recording? They knew enough to ask for it. When? The night before Peter called Martin and said he was wrong. Silence returned, heavier than before. Clara could see the outline now, though only in fragments. Peter Lanyon had noticed timing anomalies. He had traced them toward Blackrock. He had found some kind of audio fragment, perhaps accidental, perhaps incomplete. Someone had come to his house. He had withdrawn his concern. Weeks later, after fear had rearranged his life, he had died on a beach beneath a dangerous cliff path in poor weather, officially misadventure. Unofficially, a question no one had been able to bury completely. Clara's phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket. Both women flinched. One bar of service had returned. A message from Martin had come through, sent 11 minutes earlier. Storage confirms box retrieval by unknown courier. Not our requested service. Call me. Clara read it twice. Then a second message appeared. Ignore previous. Miscommunication. Box will arrive tomorrow. All fine. The second message was written in Martin's careful style, but not his voice. No apology. No context. All fine. 2 words that meant nothing and therefore meant something. Clara showed the screen to Margaret. Margaret's face hardened. They reached him. We don't know that. No, Margaret said, but we know enough to behave as if they did. Clara tried calling Martin. The line rang once, then failed. She tried again. No service. The cottage, the trust, the storage facility. Peter's old warning, Daniel on the lane. Everything that had seemed separated by distance now felt connected by a tightening wire. The people behind Blackrock were not only watching a camera feed, they were watching reactions. Requests, downloads, phone calls. The ordinary movements people made when they believed systems were neutral. Clara's own life began to appear to her as a chain of vulnerabilities. Her address was in trust paperwork. Her sister's address could be found in old emergency contact records. Her bank card would show petrol stations, supermarkets, the pharmacy in Helston. Her car registration could be read by roadside cameras. Her mobile phone moved through cell towers, leaving a trace even when calls failed. The modern world did not need to imprison a person. It only needed to remember where she had been. For years, Clara had hidden indoors because open spaces frightened her. Now she understood that walls had never made her invisible. Margaret started the engine. Where are we going? Clara asked. Not to my house. Then where? A place without cameras at the door. The Subaru moved out from behind the barn, headlights off, until Margaret was sure the lane ahead was empty. When she switched them on, the world returned in a narrow tunnel of wet hedges and shining tarmac. Clara kept watching the mirror. No lights followed. They drove inland first, away from the coast. The road twisted between farms and low fields, then through a village where the pub windows glowed amber, and 3 men stood smoking beneath an awning, laughing about something too ordinary to bear. Clara wanted, briefly and painfully, to step out into that normality, to ask someone to say that a camera loop was only a camera loop, that Peter had been wrong, that Daniel Hart was an overzealous contractor, that children did not pass through hidden corridors beneath automated lighthouses on the Cornish coast. But the village slid behind them. Margaret took a narrow road toward an old Methodist chapel converted into a community storehouse. It stood beside a cemetery wall, its windows boarded from inside, its sign faded and crooked. She parked behind it, invisible from the road, and turned off the engine. My cousin keeps tools here, she said. There's a back room, no one comes at night. Inside, the chapel smelled of damp timber, dust, and old hymn books that had somehow survived the conversion. Margaret unlocked a side door and led Clara through a narrow passage stacked with folding chairs, donated blankets, tins of paint, and boxes labeled for village fates long past. The back room contained a table, 2 mismatched chairs, an electric heater, and a single high window glazed with frosted glass. For Clara, the smallness of the room was almost a mercy. She sat and placed her handbag on the table. Margaret plugged in the heater. It clicked, hummed, and began pushing weak warmth into the damp air. We need to get the data to someone outside Cornwall, Margaret said. National Crime Agency, Clara said. Margaret looked at her. You have a contact? No. Then how? Clara did not answer immediately. Her professional life had taught her that institutions were not single minds. They were layers. Some slow, some careless, some brave, some compromised without knowing it. To send a vague warning through the wrong public channel would be to feed evidence into a system that might take days to decide whether it was serious. They did not have days. The next 72-hour interval was approaching. 3:14 a.m. tomorrow night. If Peter's warning and Margaret's memory were correct, The next blind spot would not merely conceal illegal goods. It might conceal people being moved through the cove. I have enough data to show a pattern, Clara said, not enough to prove who is behind it. Does that matter? To stop tomorrow night? Maybe not. To make it impossible to bury afterward? Yes. Margaret sat opposite her. What are you thinking? Clara opened the handbag and took out the external drive. She placed it on the table between them. It looked pitifully small. The apparent explanation is that Kerno Marine is using the blind spot to move contraband through Blackrock Cove, but Daniel tried to frame it as a restricted maritime security system. That may have been a lie, or it may be partly true. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning the infrastructure may have been built with hidden functions, not criminal at first. Surveillance, testing, classified monitoring, border work, who knows? If a contractor understood those functions better than the agencies overseeing them, they could exploit them. Or sell access. Margaret looked away. Peter said something like that. Clara straightened. What exactly? He said the door was legal before it was criminal. I thought he was rambling. Clara felt the phrase settle into place. The door was legal before it was criminal. That was why Daniel's language mattered. That was why the loops had survived. A system designed to look away for a reason, later used by people with a different reason. A blind spot born not from failure, but from permission. She connected the drive to the offline laptop she had taken from her car earlier. The machine was old and heavy, its battery unreliable, but it opened without network access. Clara pulled up her datasets, then created a compressed archive. Anomaly charts, selected video clips, tide overlays, contractor access logs, AIS maps, Peter's notes photographed from the envelope, and a plain language timeline that she began writing with the speed of someone aware that clarity could become a form of survival. She did not accuse beyond the evidence. She wrote carefully. The Blackrock Point automated lighthouse feed appears to contain recurring 4-minute substituted segments at 72-hour intervals, consistently beginning at 03:14. These events correlate with contractor access sessions, slack tide windows, and irregular vessel tracking patterns offshore. Historical notes by Peter Lanyon, now deceased, suggest similar concerns were identified approximately 3 years earlier. The attached material may indicate that the lighthouse beam angle is being temporarily altered during these intervals, potentially creating a concealed approach window into Blackrock Cove. She stopped before writing the next sentence. Potential trafficking activity suspected. The words looked too large on the screen. They required more evidence than she possessed, yet to omit them would be cowardice dressed as caution. She added, an unverified witness account describes recovered audio suggesting people may have been present during one concealed interval. This has not been independently authenticated, but the timing of the next interval creates urgent safeguarding concerns. Safeguarding, a word institutions understood. Margaret read over her shoulder. Will that be enough? It has to be enough to make someone look. And if the wrong someone looks first, Clara did not answer. At 11:40 p.m., a noise came from outside the chapel. Both women froze. Not an engine, not footsteps exactly. A dull metallic clink near the side entrance, followed by silence. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and removed a small utility knife. Clara stared at it. For cutting baler twine, Margaret whispered. Another sound came from the door. This time it was a knock. 3 slow taps. Then a voice, low and male, spoke through the wood. Margaret, it's Martin. Clara did not move. Margaret looked at her, and in that look was the same question neither of them wanted to ask. Had Martin escaped them, or had he brought them to the door? Margaret did not answer the door. The knock faded into the old chapel walls, leaving behind a silence so complete that Clara could hear the heater ticking under the table. Outside, rain moved softly across the yard. The frosted window showed nothing but a dull grey square against the night. Martin Prowse's voice came again through the wood. Margaret, Clara, please, I'm alone. The word alone did not comfort either of them. Alone could be a truth. It could also be a line given to a frightened man before sending him ahead of worse company. Clara kept one hand on the laptop and the other on the external drive. She had learned in the past 2 days how quickly ordinary trust could become a liability. Margaret stepped close to the side door, but did not touch the lock. "How did you find us?" she called. A pause. "Your cousin's chapel. Peter mentioned it once, years ago." Margaret's face tightened. That answer was too specific to dismiss, but not specific enough to make safe. "Who's with you?" "No one." "Show me your hands." There was a faint scraping outside, then the small high window near the door darkened as Martin lifted both hands into view. His palms were pale in the weak spill of light. He had no umbrella. Rain ran from the sleeves of his coat. His glasses were crooked. Margaret looked at Clara. Clara shook her head once. "Not yet." Martin seemed to understand the delay. His voice dropped lower. "They came to the trust after you left. Daniel Hart and another man. Merrick, I think. They said there had been an unauthorized data breach involving restricted maritime infrastructure. They were very calm. They knew about the storage request." Clara felt the floor shift under the logic of it. "What did you tell them?" Margaret asked. "I told them the retrieval concerned early automation material for an exhibition. And Daniel smiled as if I'd used the wrong password." The wind pressed rain against the door. Martin continued, "They asked whether you had taken anything from the office. I said no." That much was true. Margaret glanced at Clara. The original notes remained at the trust, hidden but not removed. "Then what?" Clara asked. "They left. 10 minutes later, I got a call from the storage facility confirming that the automation box had been collected by courier. I had not authorized that. While I was still on the phone, the manager changed his story, said he had misread the request, said the box was still in storage." "The two messages," Clara said. "Yes, the first was mine, the second was not." A cold line moved through Clara's back. Margaret unlocked one bolt, but kept the chain fastened. She opened the door just enough for Martin's face to appear in the gap. He looked soaked, shaken, and older than he had that morning. His usual academic softness had been replaced by something brittle. "Phone," Margaret said. Martin passed it through without argument. Clara took it and checked the screen. No signal bars, no recent outgoing calls, except one to the storage facility. One failed call to Clara and a series of messages. But that meant little. A phone could be cleaned. A frightened man could be instructed. Martin seemed to read her expression. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he said. "That's not true," Clara replied. "We have reasons. We also have reasons not to." He gave a small, humorless nod. "Fair." Margaret unfastened the chain and let him in. Martin stepped into the chapel passage, dripping onto the stone floor. Margaret re-locked the door immediately behind him, then guided him into the back room. For a moment, the three of them stood around the small table with the laptop open between them, the heater pushing out its faint warmth, the old chapel smelling of damp wood and rusted chairs. No one spoke until Martin saw the screen. "You've written a statement." "A briefing," Clara said. "To whom?" "Anyone who might act quickly enough." Martin removed his glasses and wiped them with the edge of his wet jumper. His hands were trembling. "I may have something better than anyone." From inside his coat, he took a folded sheet of paper sealed in a transparent evidence sleeve. Not an official evidence sleeve, Clara realized after a second. An archival preservation sleeve, the kind used for fragile correspondence. "What is that?" Margaret asked. "The last page from Peter's envelope." Clara stared at him. There were only 3 handwritten pages. There were 4. Margaret's face went still. Martin looked ashamed again, but this time the shame had a different edge. "I removed it years ago." "Why?" Clara asked. "Because it contained a name." The word name changed the room. Names were dangerous because they transformed patterns into responsibility. Without names, the anomaly could remain abstract, a system, a contractor, an operation, an irregularity. A name forced the mind to imagine a person signing, approving, instructing, looking away. Martin placed the sleeve on the table, but did not open it. "I thought Peter had gone too far," he said. He had begun linking the feed anomalies to people beyond Kerno Marine, public officials, maritime consultants, former enforcement officers. I could not verify any of it. The last page looked like speculation, and it frightened me because if I filed it formally, the trust would be holding an accusation we could not substantiate. Margaret's voice was quiet and dangerous. "So you hid it?" "Yes." My brother died with people calling him unstable, and you hid the page that might have explained why he was afraid. Martin flinched, but did not defend himself. Yes, Clara kept her eyes on the sleeve. What name? Martin pushed it toward her. She opened it carefully. The page inside was written in Peter's familiar blue pen, but the handwriting was less orderly than on the earlier notes. It had the look of something written after several attempts to decide whether writing it down was wise. At the top was a heading, not KMS alone. Beneath it, Peter had drawn 3 columns: contractor, access, authority. Under contractor, Kernow Marine Systems. Daniel Hart, Owen Merrick. Under access, Blackrock Remote Feeds, Lantern Motor Control, Service Gate. Maintenance Audio Cache. Under authority, 3 initials, a question mark, and 1 name written in full: Sir Alistair Venn. Clara did not know the name, but Martin did. That was obvious from the way he avoided looking at it. Margaret knew it too. The Harbour Commissioner, she said. Former, Martin replied. Clara looked between them. Who is he? Martin took a breath. Sir Alistair Venn chaired the Regional Maritime Resilience Board during the automation rollout. Before that, he worked in customs enforcement and later in private security consultancy. He was one of the public faces of coastal modernization in the southwest. Very polished, very connected. Alive? Clara asked. Yes. Living then. A real person in their world, not a dead name in Peter's archive. That made everything more dangerous. It was one thing to identify technical manipulation by contractors. It was another to suggest that a respected former official might have provided authority, cover, or access. The evidence on the page did not prove that. Peter himself had marked the column with uncertainty. A question mark sat near the initials. The name might represent a suspicion, a contact, a meeting, a signature on some innocuous procurement file. Clara had to be careful. Did Peter explain why he wrote Venn's name? She asked. Martin shook his head. Not to me. Margaret leaned over the page. He mentioned a man with a title, not the name. He said that was how the door stayed legal. There it was again. The door was legal before it was criminal. Clara felt the hidden structure begin to show itself. Not clearly, not completely, but enough that the fragments no longer floated apart. A public modernization program had automated Blackrock Point. Automation required contractors. Contractors required remote access. Remote access required oversight. Oversight required people with authority, or at least people whose names made questions stop moving upward. Somewhere within that chain, a 4-minute concealment function had been created or permitted, perhaps originally under a security justification. Later, Kernow Marine Systems had learned to use it as a corridor. The lighthouse beam could be adjusted, the feed could be looped, vessel movement could be masked. The cove could become invisible at precisely the moment the tide allowed entry. But still, one piece was missing. What came through the corridor? Clara had data suggesting traffic. Peter had audio suggesting people. Margaret had memory. None of it yet proved the next drop, or its human cost, in a form that would force urgent action. She looked at Martin. Did Peter's envelope contain anything about the audio device? No. Margaret sat slowly. He hid it. Where would he hide something important? Clara asked. In the last place he thought anyone would go. Margaret's eyes moved toward the darkened chapel walls, then beyond them in memory, or the first place everyone overlooked. Martin frowned. His house was cleared after he died, wasn't it? Most of it. I kept some tools, his notebooks, old photographs, things that felt like him. Where are they? Clara asked. At my house. No one needed to say why that was a problem. If Daniel Hart had called Margaret that afternoon, if Merrick and Hart had reached Clara's cottage, then Margaret's house might already be watched or searched. Margaret seemed to be thinking the same thing. There is one thing I didn't keep there. Clara waited. Peter had a boat. A boat, Martin said. A little cabin boat. Nothing grand. He kept it at Penryn for years, then moved it upriver when mooring fees went up. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Too much paperwork at first, then too much memory. It's been sitting under cover at a yard near Mylor. I pay the storage because grief makes fools of people. Clara leaned forward. Would he have hidden the dictaphone there? If he wanted it somewhere, no one connected to his house would search, perhaps. "Did anyone know about the boat?" Martin asked. "People knew he had one. I doubt anyone knows I kept it." Clara looked at the laptop clock, 12:28 a.m. The next blind spot was roughly 26 hours away. The National Crime Agency briefing was still incomplete. The early import drives had likely been taken or tampered with. Peter's possible audio recording might be the missing proof that transformed concern into immediate safeguarding action. But retrieving it meant leaving the chapel, moving through the night, approaching a boatyard that could have cameras, gates, neighbors, unknown access points, and open space. Always open space. Clara's mind pressed against the thought and recoiled. The cottage garden had nearly undone her. The field behind it had felt endless. A boatyard at night, beside dark water, beneath masts and empty hulls, might be worse. Martin looked at her. "You don't have to come." "Yes," Clara said. Margaret studied her. "You're sure?" No. The honesty seemed to steady all three of them. Clara closed the briefing file and saved it in 3 formats. She copied it to the external drive, to a memory card, and to Martin's phone after switching off its network connection. Then she added Peter's final page to the evidence folder, labeling it carefully. Unverified handwritten note by Peter Lanyon. Contains name requiring corroboration, not proof of wrongdoing. She paused before saving. That caveat mattered. They were not making a documentary in the dark. They were building a bridge strong enough for others to cross without falling into speculation. The truth, if it existed, would not be served by reckless accusation. It would be served by evidence that survived challenge. At 12:51 a.m., they left the chapel. Martin's car was parked behind a hedge a short walk away. Margaret insisted on driving the Subaru separately in case one vehicle was stopped. Clara rode with Margaret. Martin would follow at a distance, headlights dipped, and if either car was blocked, the other would continue. It was a plan made by frightened amateurs, but it was better than no plan. The roads toward Mylor were slick and empty, rain thinned to mist. The night opened in brief glimpses between hedges, fields, black trees, the pale suggestion of water in the distance. Clara forced herself not to count exits, not to measure every exposed stretch, not to imagine vehicles emerging from each side road. She watched instead the rhythm of the wipers and the red pinpricks of Martin's headlights far behind them. Margaret said, "Peter named the boat Elsie. After someone?" "Our mother. He said boats behaved better when named after women who tolerated no nonsense." It was the first almost warm thing Clara had heard from her. They reached the boatyard after 1. It lay beyond a locked metal gate at the end of a lane that smelled of mud, salt and diesel. Beyond the fence, covered boats rested on stands like sleeping animals. Masts rose into the mist, their halyards tapping softly in the wind. A security light glowed near the office, but much of the yard remained in shadow. Margaret cut the engine before the gate. "I have a key," she whispered. Martin pulled in behind them, stepping out with a torch held low. The 3 of them moved quickly, though Clara's legs felt unsteady. The openness of the yard pressed at her immediately. Too much sky, too many dark shapes, too many places a person could stand unseen between hulls and trailers. Margaret unlocked the gate. It gave a metallic shriek as it opened. All 3 froze. No lights came on, no voice called out. The halyards continued their soft, irregular tapping. Elsie was stored beneath a green tarpaulin near the far end, beside a stack of lobster pots and a rusting trailer. Margaret led them there without hesitation. Her hands shook only when she reached for the tarp. "Peter used to keep odd things in the cabin lining," she said. "Spare cash, notes. Once my birthday present, because he forgot where he put it for 3 months." They climbed onto the boat one at a time. The deck was slick beneath Clara's boots. The cabin smelled of mildew, old rope and closed air. Martin held the torch while Margaret pulled back a narrow panel behind the small berth. Nothing. She checked beneath the seat cushions. Nothing. In a drawer under the chart table, they found expired flares, a cracked compass, a pencil, and a packet of ginger biscuits so old the wrapper had faded. No dictaphone. Margaret's face tightened with each empty space. "Maybe he didn't hide it here," Martin said softly. Clara did not answer. She was looking at the chart table, A laminated coastal chart lay beneath a sheet of cloudy plastic. Blackrock Point was outside the usual range for a small boat from this mooring, but someone had marked the edge of the chart with a small pencil cross and a set of numbers. Not coordinates. A bearing. Clara lifted the plastic. Beneath the chart, taped to the underside of the table, was a small grey dictaphone. For a moment, none of them touched it. Then Margaret made a sound that might have been a sob if she had allowed it to become one. Clara carefully peeled away the brittle tape and lowered the device into her palm. It was older than she expected, scratched along one side, the battery cover held with another strip of tape. A tiny label on the back bore Peter's handwriting, BLK Cash. Do not copy online. Martin whispered, "Does it still work?" Clara slid the switch. Nothing happened. "Battery," she said. The relief and disappointment arrived together. The recording existed, perhaps, but could not yet speak. Then, from outside the cabin, came the crunch of gravel. One step, then another. The three of them looked toward the dark oval of the cabin doorway. A torch beam passed across the tarpaulin. Someone was in the boatyard. The torch beam moved slowly across the tarpaulin, turning the damp green fabric silver wherever it passed. Clara lowered the dictaphone into her coat pocket and closed her hand around it through the cloth. The small device felt too light for what it might contain. A dead battery, a damaged tape, a few seconds of corrupted audio, or the one piece of evidence Peter Lanyon had hidden when every other part of his life began to close around him. Outside the cabin, gravel shifted again. Margaret raised one finger to her lips. Martin killed his torch. Darkness settled over the boat's cramped interior. Not total darkness. Thin grey light leaked through the edges of the tarpaulin, enough to outline the low berth, the chart table, Margaret's profile, Martin's hunched shoulders near the doorway. The cabin smelled of mold, rope, old diesel, and cold fiberglass. Clara's breath seemed too loud. Every instinct in her body wanted to shrink down, become still, become furniture, become part of the boat until whoever was outside moved on. A man's voice came from the yard. Gates open. Not Daniel Hart, not Owen Merrick. Younger perhaps, less polished. The words were quiet but carried clearly in the wet night. Another voice answered from farther away. Check the far row. Margaret leaned close to Clara's ear. There's a forehatch, she whispered. Too small for Martin. Maybe for us. Clara looked toward the front of the cabin. A narrow hatch sat above a cramped storage space, partly hidden beneath a coil of rope and a folded sail cover. Beyond it would be the foredeck, then the edge of the boat, then the open yard. Even if she could squeeze through, she would have to climb down from the boat stand in the dark. Her mind refused the picture. The open boatyard had already felt unbearable when they entered it. Now, with unknown men between the hulls, the space outside seemed not merely wide, but alive. Too many shadows. Too many angles. Too much sky. A torch beam struck the cabin window. All three froze. The light swept across the cloudy glass, paused, then moved away. Clara could see dust motes floating in the thin glow left behind. Her chest tightened so painfully that for one moment she feared the sound of her breathing would betray them. She pressed her fist against her sternum and tried to count. 4 in, hold, 6 out. The numbers trembled, but they held. Outside, footsteps passed the stern. Nothing here, the younger voice said. Look properly, the second voice replied. The footsteps stopped. The tarpaulin shifted. A hand pressed against it from outside, testing the shape beneath. Martin, nearest the doorway, looked at Clara. His face was barely visible, but she could read the apology in it. He believed he had led them here. Perhaps he had. Perhaps the boatyard had been watched, or Margaret followed, or Peter's old boat never as forgotten as she believed. Perhaps the system had fewer blind spots for people like Clara than it created for itself. The hand moved along the tarp. Then the yard was flooded with light, not from a torch. From headlights, a vehicle had entered the gate and turned toward the office, its beams sweeping across rows of boats, trailers, masts, and rain. The men outside reacted at once. One swore. The hand left the tarpaulin. Footsteps moved away from the boat. A car door opened near the office. A woman's voice called out, sharp and irritated. Who's there? Margaret's eyes widened. The yard owner, she whispered. The interruption lasted only seconds, but seconds were enough. Margaret pushed the coil of rope aside and lifted the forehatch. Cold air flowed in. Clara saw a rectangle of wet night beyond it. Her body recoiled before she moved. "Go," Margaret whispered. Clara shook her head. "Clara, I can't." The words were small and humiliating, but true. The hatch might as well have opened onto the edge of a tower. Outside, voices overlapped near the office. The yard owner demanded an explanation. One of the men muttered something about a security call-out. Another said they had found the gate open. The lie was ordinary enough to pass if no one looked too closely. Martin moved toward the cabin door. "I'll distract them." "No," Margaret hissed. "They know someone's here. If all of us stay, they find all of us." Before either woman could stop him, Martin stepped out onto the deck. "Hello?" he called, his voice unsteady but loud. "Is someone there?" The conversation near the office stopped. For half a heartbeat, the whole yard listened. Then one of the men shouted, "Stay where you are." Martin did not stay. He climbed down the stern ladder with awkward haste, slipping once, catching himself against the rail. Clara saw his silhouette through the cabin doorway, moving away from the boat and into the wash of headlights. "I'm from the Maritime Records Trust," he called. "We had permission to inspect a stored vessel." It was a terrible lie, too formal, too specific, too Martin, but it pulled the men away. Margaret seized Clara's arm. "Now!" Clara looked at the forehatch again. The night beyond it waited. Something in her broke then, but not in the way she expected. For years, she had imagined panic as a collapse, a surrender, a narrowing of the world, until nothing remained but fear. Now she discovered another version. Panic could become anger, not clean courage, not bravery, but a furious refusal to let fear decide the shape of one more room, one more road, one more dark opening. She pushed herself through the hatch. The metal rim scraped her hip. Her boot caught on the sail cover. For a moment she was stuck halfway, rain striking her face, the boatyard around her huge and blurred and bright in patches. Margaret shoved from behind, and Clara slid forward onto the foredeck, landing hard on her elbows. Pain flashed through her arms. She held back a cry and crawled toward the rail. The drop looked impossible. In daylight, it would have been manageable. A boat on stands, a ladder at the side, damp ground below. In the dark, with headlights moving and men shouting near the office, it seemed like stepping from a roof into nothing. Margaret came through behind her with much more grace. "Left side," she whispered. "There's a cradle support. Use it like a step." Clara swung one leg over the rail. Her boot found metal, slipped, found it again. She lowered herself, fingers gripping the cold rail until they burned. The dictaphone pressed against her pocket. The external drive in her handbag bumped against her ribs. She descended by touch, one step, then another, then dropped the final 2 feet into gravel. The sound seemed enormous. No one turned. Martin was still talking, voice raised now in bureaucratic indignation. "This is completely inappropriate. If there's an issue with access, we can resolve it during office hours." "Where are the women?" a man demanded. "What women?" Martin replied. The blow came immediately. Clara did not see it, but she heard it. A dull impact, a gasp, then the yard owner shouting. Margaret's hand clamped around Clara's wrist and pulled her into the narrow gap between 2 covered boats. They moved crouched and fast, keeping to shadows thrown by hulls and trailers. The yard had become a maze of dead vessels, their tarpaulins breathing in the wind. Ropes tapped against masts with small nervous sounds. Clara tried not to look toward the open spaces between rows. She followed Margaret's back, one hand against cold fiberglass when the dizziness surged. Behind them, Martin shouted, "Run!" This time, there was no pretending. Footsteps broke across the gravel. Over there. A torch beam sliced through the row behind them. Margaret turned sharply between a stack of pallets and a rusting shipping container. At the far end was a pedestrian gate Clara had not noticed earlier, half hidden by a torn blue tarp and a heap of old chain. Margaret fumbled with the latch. Locked. "Move," Clara whispered. Margaret stared at her. Clara pulled the letter opener from her coat pocket. She had taken it from the cottage without thinking. An absurd little object more suited to envelopes than locks. But the latch was old, the chain slack, and desperation made tools of whatever survived. She worked the narrow blade beneath the rusted clasp, twisting until metal scraped metal. A torch beam hit the container beside them. Stop, the clasp gave. Margaret shoved the gate open, and they slipped through into a lane behind the yard. Clara expected a road, but found instead a muddy footpath running between a drainage ditch and a stone wall. Branches clawed at her coat. Margaret pulled the gate shut behind them, but did not try to relock it. They ran. Not far. Neither of them had the breath for far. The path curved downhill toward a cluster of dark sheds, and then opened beside a creek, where small boats lay tilted in the mud at low tide. The water smelled of salt, weed, and diesel. Across the creek, a few cottage windows glowed warmly, unreachable as another country. Margaret slowed near an old boathouse with a sagging roof. In here. They slipped inside through a side door that hung loose on one hinge. The interior was black, except for a crack of moonless grey through the broken boards. Fishing nets, rotten planks, and a skeletal dinghy filled the space. Clara leaned against the wall, shaking so violently she could barely remain standing. Margaret listened at the door. Footsteps reached the lane above, then split in two directions. A man cursed. Another called out that the gate was open. No one came down the path immediately. Clara pulled the dictaphone from her pocket. "We need to hear it," she said. Margaret looked at her as if she had spoken in another language. "Now! If they catch us, it may be the last chance to know whether it matters." "It matters. To us. I need it to matter to people who don't know Peter." Margaret said nothing. Clara opened the battery compartment. The old batteries inside had leaked slightly but not destroyed the contacts. She removed them with the edge of the letter opener, wiping corrosion onto a tissue from her pocket. Then she looked around the boathouse. "Do you have anything?" Margaret searched her coat. Torch, keys, purse. Clara checked the torch. 2 AA batteries. The dictaphone needed the same. Margaret hesitated only a second before handing it over. In the darkness of the boathouse, with men searching somewhere above them and Martin possibly injured in the yard, Clara inserted the batteries and slid the switch. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the device clicked. A red light appeared. The tiny speaker hissed with old static. Margaret covered her mouth. Clara pressed play. At first, there was only noise. Wind, water, a low vibration, perhaps machinery. Then a metallic thud echoed through the speaker, followed by 2 short bursts of static. The recording quality was poor, compressed and uneven, as if recovered from some temporary buffer never meant for human ears. A man's voice emerged, distant but clear enough. "Keep them low." Another voice, closer. "Light in 90. Water slapped against metal. Someone coughed. Then came the sound Margaret had described. Not an animal, not machinery. A muffled human cry, quickly smothered. Clara felt the blood leave her face. A woman whispered, close to the microphone, breath broken by cold or fear. "Stay quiet, please, stay quiet." A child made a sound then, small, frightened, instantly hushed. Another male voice spoke, and this time Clara leaned closer. The words were distorted, but not lost. "Tell Ven the package is breathing." The recording cut off. The boathouse seemed to vanish around Clara. For several seconds, the only sound was rain dripping through the broken roof, and Margaret's shallow breathing beside her. Ven. Not a question mark now. Not proof of everything, but a spoken name inside the hidden interval. On a recording Peter had risked everything to preserve. Clara rewound 5 seconds and played it again. "Tell Ven the package is breathing." She stopped the device before the child's sound could replay. Margaret turned away, one hand pressed against the wall. Clara carefully removed the batteries, then placed the dictaphone into her handbag beside the external drive. Her hand shook, but her mind had become frighteningly clear. They had the final path toward the truth now. Not the whole truth. Not the orchestrator's face. Not the legal origin of the blind spot. But enough to force action if it reached the right place before the next interval. A shout came from the path above. Down by the creek. Torchlight flashed through the cracked boards of the boathouse. Margaret grabbed Clara's sleeve. "Back door." "There is no back door." Margaret pointed to the rotten dinghy leaning against the far wall. Behind it, partly hidden by netting, was a narrow opening where boards had fallen away toward the mudflats. Outside lay the creek. open, exposed, black with low tide. Clara stared at it. The old terror rose again, but this time it met the sound from the recording, a child trying not to cry in the dark beneath Blackrock Point. Margaret whispered, "Clara." The torch beam found the door. Clara climbed through the broken boards and stepped out onto the mud. The mud took Clara's boot almost to the ankle. For one terrible second, she thought it would not let go. The creek bed sucked at the sole with a wet, intimate sound, and the weight of the handbag against her side pulled her off balance. She caught herself against the broken boards of the boathouse, splinters biting into her palm. Behind her, Margaret climbed through the gap with the quick, practical movement of someone who had known Cornish mud since childhood. "Keep to the stones," Margaret whispered. Clara could barely see them. The moon was hidden behind low cloud, and the only light came from distant cottage windows across the creek and the torch beams, now moving around the front of the boathouse. The mudflat spread before her as a black, glistening emptiness, veined with shallow channels. Boats lay tilted on their sides, ropes slack, hulls knocking softly against wooden posts. The air smelled of salt, rot, seaweed, and old fuel, open space. Every part of Clara's body rejected it. There were no walls close enough to touch, no ceiling, no familiar desk, no radiator, no narrow hallway she could measure in steps. The sky pressed down and opened out at the same time, vast and low and suffocating. The creek seemed to breathe beneath her, every shift of mud sounding like something waking below the surface. A man shouted from the boathouse door. They went out the back. Margaret seized Clara's wrist and pulled her forward. They moved across the mud in a staggered line, stepping from one embedded stone to another, then onto patches of firmer sand. Clara's boots slipped repeatedly. Twice Margaret had to catch her. The handbag struck against Clara's hip with each movement, the external drive and dictaphone inside it knocking together like fragile bones. Torchlight burst from the broken boards behind them. "Stop," a voice called. Clara did not stop. Something had changed after hearing Peter's recording. Fear remained in her body, but it was no longer the largest thing inside her. The child's muffled sound had cut through years of protective shrinking. It did not make her brave. It made retreat impossible. They reached a line of moored dinghies, their bows resting in the mud. Margaret crouched behind one and pulled Clara down beside her. A torch beam swept across the creek bed, passing over the tilted boats, the posts, the wet ropes, and the reflective mud. Clara held her breath. Rain ticked against the upturned hull above them. Two men emerged from the boathouse and began picking their way toward the creek. One was Owen Merrick. Even in the poor light, Clara recognized the broad shoulders, the controlled impatience in his movement. The other was younger, the same voice from the boatyard perhaps, carrying his torch too high and slipping on the mud with visible frustration. Merrick spoke without raising his voice. "They won't get far." Margaret leaned close to Clara's ear. "There's a footbridge beyond the bend. If we reach it, we can get to the road." "How far?" 200 yards. It might as well have been 2 miles. Clara looked toward the bend in the creek. The mud curved away between dark banks and moored boats, disappearing behind reeds. The bridge was not visible. Neither was safety. Behind them, Merrick was closer now, moving carefully but confidently. He knew enough about the creek not to rush. Margaret waited until his torch swung left, then pulled Clara forward again. They moved lower this time, half crouched, using the boats as cover. Clara's breathing rasped in her throat. At one point, her boots sank deep, and she nearly fell face first into the mud. The handbag slipped from her shoulder. She caught it by the strap just as it hit the ground. The dictaphone inside clicked against the external drive. Merrick's torch snapped toward the sound. There, Margaret pushed Clara ahead. "Go!" They ran badly, slipping, stumbling, no longer silent. The creek bed narrowed. Reeds whipped at Clara's coat. Mud splashed up her trousers. Behind them, the younger man cursed as he lost footing. But Merrick kept coming. The footbridge appeared suddenly out of the dark. A narrow wooden span between two banks, slick with rain, fenced by low rails. Beyond it lay a lane and perhaps houses. Clara climbed the bank on hands and knees, grabbing grass, roots, anything that held. Margaret followed close behind. A hand closed around Clara's ankle. She cried out and kicked instinctively. Merrick had reached the bank below. His fingers tightened over her boot, dragging her backward. For one suspended moment, Clara saw his face clearly in Margaret's torchlight, wet, hard, and utterly without panic. Not a monster, not a villain from a story. A working man doing a task he had decided was necessary. "Give me the bag," he said. Margaret swung the torch at him. It struck the side of his head with a dull crack. Merrick grunted and released Clara's ankle, but he did not fall. He grabbed Margaret's coat as she turned, pulling her off balance. She slipped, struck the bank with her shoulder, and slid halfway down toward the mud. Clara reached for her. Merrick reached for the handbag. The strap tore. For a second, everything important hung between them. The drive, the dictaphone, the briefing, Peter's voice, the child's cry. The only proof they had that the blind spot concealed more than illegal goods. Clara clutched the torn strap with both hands while Merrick pulled from below. "Let go," he said. His voice was low, almost weary. Clara looked past him into the creek. The younger man was struggling toward them. Torchlight shook across mud and water. Margaret tried to rise, one hand pressed to her shoulder, face twisted with pain. The handbag began to slip from Clara's grip. Then Martin appeared on the bridge. He was limping badly, one side of his face swollen, his coat torn at the collar. In his hands he held an oar, taken perhaps from the boatyard or from one of the dinghies along the creek. He looked absurd and heroic and terrified. "Leave her," he shouted. Merrick glanced up. That was enough. Clara released the torn strap with one hand, drove her fingers into the mud beside her, and kicked backward again with all the force she had. Her heel caught Merrick in the wrist. He lost his grip. The handbag flew upward, striking Clara's chest, and she rolled onto the bank. Martin came down from the bridge and swung the oar, not at Merrick's head, but across the narrow path between them. It cracked against a wooden post with a sound like a gunshot. Merrick flinched back. Margaret used the moment to scramble up the bank, gasping. The younger man shouted from below, "Owen!" Merrick looked toward him, then up at the three figures on the bank. He could still climb. He could still come after them. But headlights appeared on the lane beyond the bridge, turning the wet road briefly silver. A car slowed. A window opened. A woman's voice called, "Everything all right?" The ordinary question saved them. Merrick stepped back into the shadow beneath the bank. Martin seized Clara's arm. Margaret took the other, and together they crossed the footbridge toward the lane. Clara wanted to stop, to answer the woman, to ask for help, to collapse beside the first stranger who had unknowingly interrupted the night. But Margaret kept moving. "Not here," she said through gritted teeth. "Not until we know who is who." They reached the road and turned uphill. The car that had slowed was already moving on, perhaps reassured by the sight of three adults on a wet lane, perhaps unwilling to become involved in something that looked like trouble. Clara did not blame the driver. She understood now how ordinary people survived by misreading danger as inconvenience. Martin led them to his car, parked crookedly near a lay-by half a mile from the yard. He had escaped the boatyard after the yard owner's arrival caused enough confusion for him to run. His phone was gone. His glasses were cracked. He did not know whether the yard owner was safe. Margaret's shoulder needed attention. Clara's palms were bleeding. Martin's face was bruised and swelling, but the handbag remained with them. Inside the car, Clara opened it with shaking hands. The external drive was intact. The dictaphone was still there. The laptop was gone. For a moment, she simply stared into the bag, unable to understand what absence meant. Then she remembered the climb through the forehatch, the run between boats, the fall in the mud, the torn strap. Somewhere in that violent sequence, the old offline laptop had been lost, dropped, or taken. It held copies of the briefing file and Peter's scanned notes, but not the only copies. She had the data on the drive. She had the dictaphone. She had memory cards. Still, the loss mattered. The laptop had contained her working files arranged in the clearest form. The timeline, the careful caveats, the context that made the evidence usable. Without it, they had proof, but less time to shape it into something others could understand. Martin started the car. "Where?" he asked. Clara looked at the dashboard clock. 2:38 a.m. Not the Blackrock interval. Not yet. That would be the following night. But the hour still sent a chill through her. They had crossed one threshold, another waited. "We need power," she said. "A computer, internet outside the trust network. Somewhere public when it opens." Margaret leaned back, her face grey with pain. "Libraries." Clara turned to her. "Public terminals," Margaret said. "My sister used to volunteer at Helston Library. Opens at 9:30. Martin shook his head. "Too late if they're searching roads by morning." "Then we hide until morning." The word hide sounded weak now, but there was no better one. They drove inland again, avoiding main roads when possible. Rain softened to mist, then stopped. The world became a sequence of hedges, dark farmhouses, sleeping villages, and occasional pools of streetlight. Clara sat in the back with the handbag on her lap, one hand inside it, fingers resting on the dictaphone. Peter's voice was not on the recording. That struck her only then. He had found it, hidden it, died beneath a cliff, and yet the evidence he preserved contained no trace of him except the label on the back and the terrible discipline of keeping it offline. The recording had survived him better than people had. At 3:21 a.m., they stopped in a farm lay-by above a valley. Martin cut the engine. No one spoke. Exhaust ticked beneath the bonnet. Far away, a dog barked once, then again. The eastern sky remained dark. Clara took out the dictaphone and, against her own reluctance, played the final line one more time into Martin's small backup audio recorder, an old device he used for oral history interviews and had found in his glove compartment. "Tell then the package is breathing." The words emerged damaged but clear. Martin closed his eyes. Margaret stared out the window. Clara saved the duplicate recording onto a memory card, then placed the card inside the lining of her coat. She kept the dictaphone in the handbag. The full drive went beneath the rear seat, wedged behind a torn flap of upholstery. Each copy separated from the others, each one a small resistance against disappearance. But separation also meant risk. By dawn, Margaret's shoulder had stiffened so badly she could barely move her arm. Martin insisted on taking her to a minor injuries unit under a false explanation. Margaret refused at first, then nearly fainted when she stepped out of the car near an abandoned farm track to stretch. The decision became unavoidable. They left her at a small community hospital just after 7, using a side entrance and no full explanation. Margaret gripped Clara's hand before going inside with Martin. "Do not wait for me," she said. "We need you. You need the evidence out more." Clara wanted to argue, but the older woman's face stopped her. Grief had already taught Margaret the difference between loyalty and usefulness. Martin stayed with her long enough to make sure she was admitted under the story of a fall on wet steps. Clara remained in the car, alone for the first time since fleeing the cottage. The morning light arrived thin and colorless over the hospital car park. People began entering with ordinary injuries, ordinary appointments, ordinary faces. Clara watched them and felt a strange envy. Their lives still obeyed the visible rules. At 8:06, Martin returned. Banasi, his face was grim. Margaret's stable, bruised shoulder, maybe a small fracture. She told the nurse she slipped. And there was a man in the waiting area who left when I arrived. Clara looked toward the entrance. "Did you know him?" "No, but knowing no longer mattered. Recognition had become less useful than pattern. They had less than 20 hours before the next blind spot. They had no safe house, no secure network, no clear contact, no laptop, one damaged witness in hospital, and evidence that named a respected former official without proving the chain around him. They also had Peter's recording, Clara's data, and the unavoidable fact that someone had worked very hard to stop those things from leaving Cornwall. That effort, Clara thought, was its own kind of corroboration. At 9:18, they reached Helston. The town was waking under low cloud, shop shutters lifting, buses hissing at stops, people buying newspapers and coffee, school children moving in clusters beneath backpacks and raincoats. Clara sat in the passenger seat outside the public library and stared at the entrance. Glass doors, wide pavement, open square, people. All the things her body had spent years avoiding. Martin turned off the engine. "I can do it." Clara shook her head. "You're hurt," he said, "exhausted. You don't have to prove anything." "This isn't proof of courage," Clara replied. "What is it then?" She looked down at her mud-stained hands. Dried blood marked the lines of her palms. Beneath her coat lining, the memory card pressed lightly against her side. Beneath the rear seat, the drive waited. In the handbag, the dictaphone lay silent. "It's custody," she said. Martin did not ask what she meant. For most of her life, Clara had understood custody as an archival principle, the chain by which a record remained trustworthy. Who held it, who copied it, who altered it? Who could testify that it had not been changed in the dark? Now she was part of that chain, and chains only mattered if they did not break at the final door. She stepped out of the car. The pavement seemed too wide, the library doors too far away. A bus exhaled at the stop behind her, and for one dizzy instant, the sound became London, St. Pancras. The crowd, the fall, the impossible press of bodies and air. Her legs weakened. Then across the square, she saw a white van slow beside the curb, no markings. The passenger window lowered. Daniel Hart looked out at her. He did not shout, he did not move. He simply raised one hand, showing her the small grey laptop she had lost in the boatyard. Then he smiled, as if to say that the final evidence had already begun to disappear. Daniel Hart held the laptop against the lowered window as if it were a found umbrella he intended to return. For one suspended moment, Clara Evans could not move. The square outside Helston Library continued around her with cruel normality. A bus sighed at the stop. A woman with a shopping trolley stepped carefully around a puddle. Two schoolboys in dark blazers argued over a phone screen. Somewhere nearby, a bakery door opened and released the warm smell of bread into the cold morning air. And across the road, inside an unmarked white van, Daniel Hart smiled. The smile was not triumphant. That would have been easier to understand. It was sympathetic, almost regretful, the expression of a man who believed he knew how frightened people behaved once cornered. He lifted the laptop slightly, then lowered it out of sight. Martin, still seated behind the wheel, saw him too. "Clara," he said, voice tight, "get back in." But Clara did not. For years, her body had been teaching her to retreat before thought could intervene. Leave the station, avoid the concourse. Turn away from the square. Choose the side door, the narrow room, the low ceiling, the safe chair near the wall. Fear had become not an emotion, but an architecture. It built corridors inside her life and told her they were protection. Now she stood in the open, with Daniel Hart watching from a van and the library doors ahead. The distance was less than 30 yards. It felt like a coastline. Daniel's van pulled away from the curb, not quickly, not dramatically. It rolled toward the end of the square and stopped again near a loading bay, still within sight of the library entrance. Clara understood the message. He did not need to chase her. He only needed her to know he could. Martin got out of the car and came around to her side. "He has the laptop," he said. "I know. If he has the working files, he has one copy, the clearest copy." Clara looked at the library. Its glass doors reflected the pale sky and the movement of pedestrians behind her. Inside, she could see a notice board, a rack of local history leaflets, and the faint glow of computer terminals beyond the reception desk. "We still have the drive," she said, "and the dictaphone, and the memory card." Martin followed her gaze. "There may be cameras inside." "There are cameras everywhere." The sentence surprised her, not because it was new, but because it no longer sounded like reassurance. 2 days earlier, cameras had meant evidence, security, a record that events could not simply vanish. Now she understood that a camera could lie more elegantly than a person. It could look directly at a truth and, with the right instruction, remember something else. Daniel Hart had taught her that. Peter Lanyon had died trying to prove it. Clara reached into her coat lining and removed the memory card. She kept it hidden in her palm. The external drive remained beneath the rear seat of Martin's car, too visible if carried openly, too important to risk losing in a struggle. The dictaphone was in her handbag, wrapped inside a scarf. She had learned enough now not to keep every truth in one place. "Bring the drive in 5 minutes," she said. Martin stared at her. "What?" "Not with me, not yet. If they stop me before I reach a terminal, keep moving." "And go where?" "To the police station, to a solicitor, to a newspaper, anywhere with people and doors that lock from the inside." "Clara." 5 minutes. He looked as if he wanted to argue. Then he saw her face and did not. Clara crossed the square. The first 10 steps were the worst. The pavement seemed to rise under her boots, not physically but in the old internal way, as if the open space itself were resisting her passage. Her breath shortened, her vision narrowed. She heard wheels on wet road, a gull above the rooftops, a cyclist's brakes squealing somewhere to her left. Every sound entered too sharply. She kept moving. The library doors opened automatically with a soft mechanical sigh. Warm air touched her face. Inside, the world changed. Carpet underfoot, fluorescent light, shelves arranged in quiet rows, a display of crime novels near the entrance, their covers promising mysteries that ended neatly within 400 pages. The ordinary calm of the place nearly undid her. People sat reading newspapers. An elderly man searched the local history shelf. A mother whispered to a child in a pushchair. A librarian looked up from the desk and smiled with professional patience. "Can I help you?" she asked. Clara almost said no. Habit again. Reflexive privacy. Do not be a bother. Do not make a scene. Do not bring the outside world into a quiet room. Instead, she said, "I need to use a public computer, urgently." The librarian blinked once at Clara's mud-stained coat, bruised hands, and the expression she could no longer arrange into normality. "Do you have a library card?" "No." There it was. The small bureaucratic gate, usually harmless, today unbearable. The librarian hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Are you in danger?" The question was so direct that Clara nearly stepped back. "Yes," she said. The librarian's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Her name badge read Anita. "There's a staff office," Anita said. "This way." Clara shook her head. "No, I need a computer with internet access now, and I need you to call the police, but not through any local contact connected to maritime infrastructure. Tell them there is a safeguarding risk connected to a coastal drop at Blackrock Point tonight. Tell them evidence is being uploaded to the National Crime Agency reporting portal and to multiple newsrooms." Anita stared at her. Clara heard how impossible it sounded. Then the librarian reached under the desk and pressed something Clara could not see. "Computer 3 is open," Anita said quietly. "I'll make the call." That small act of belief almost broke Clara. She moved to the computer terminal. It sat between two empty desks near the reference section. The machine was slow to wake. Every second stretched. Through the front windows, she could see the square, Martin's car, the loading bay where the white van had been. It was still there. Daniel was no longer inside. Clara inserted the memory card into the terminal. The computer hesitated. A message appeared asking whether to scan the device. She clicked. No. The folder opened. Files still there. Her hands shook as she began transferring them to a temporary desktop folder. Anomaly charts, selected video clips, AIS overlays. Peter's photographed note naming Venn as an unverified lead, the duplicated audio from the dictaphone, and Clara's shorter written briefing reconstructed from memory before dawn. It was not as complete as the lost laptop version. It was enough. She opened the National Crime Agency public reporting page. The library internet crawled. At the reception desk, Anita spoke quietly into a phone. Clara glanced toward the entrance. Daniel Hart walked in. He had removed his hood. Without the rain and darkness, he looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Late 40s, neat beard, dark coat, expression composed. He paused near the crime novel display, looked around once, and then saw Clara at the terminal. He did not approach immediately. That frightened her more than if he had. He walked to the librarian's desk. Anita lowered the phone but did not hang up. "Good morning," Daniel said. "I'm looking for a colleague. She may be confused. Middle-aged woman, dark coat, possibly distressed." Anita's voice remained calm. "This is a public library, sir." "Yes, of course." He smiled. "Her name is Clara Evans. She's handling sensitive material belonging to her employer. There may be a data protection issue." Clara kept typing. Her fingers made mistakes. She corrected them. "Attached file. Attach another. Add summary. Contact details. Urgent risk. Blackrock Point. Next event. Zo 314 tonight. Potential concealed maritime landing. Possible vulnerable persons. Evidence attached." The upload bar appeared. 2%. Daniel looked toward her again. Anita stepped slightly away from the desk, blocking his line of movement without seeming to. Sir, if there's a data matter, you'll need to contact the relevant office. I have. Then I'm sure they'll advise you. His smile thinned. You don't understand what she is interfering with. No, Anita said. I probably don't. The upload reached 9%. Daniel began walking toward Clara. Anita said loudly, Sir, please stay where you are. Several heads turned. The elderly man near local history looked over his newspaper. The mother near the pushchair pulled her child closer. A teenager at another terminal removed one earbud. Daniel stopped, irritated now. The public gaze changed the mathematics of the room. He could intimidate 2 women in a cottage. He could block a country lane in the rain. He could stand beside a van with stolen equipment and imply consequences. But a library on a weekday morning was not darkness. It was witnesses, fluorescent light, CCTV, voices, names. The upload reached 14%. Too slow. Clara opened her email in another tab and began attaching the smallest files to drafts addressed to 3 national newspapers, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency tip line, and an old academic contact at Exeter who had once worked with government maritime datasets. She did not know who would respond first. She only needed the evidence to leave the room in more directions than Daniel could block. At the front doors, Martin entered with the external drive concealed inside a folded local newspaper. Daniel saw him. For the first time, his composure cracked. Mr. Prowse, he said. Martin stopped near the entrance, face bruised, glasses taped at one hinge. He looked frightened. He looked exhausted, but he did not look away. I've spoken to the police, Martin lied. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Anita, still by the desk, said into the phone, Yes, he is here now. Dark coat. He is confronting patrons. The upload reached 28%. Daniel moved quickly then, not toward Clara, but toward Martin. Give me what you're carrying. Martin stepped back. No, you have no idea what damage you're doing. Then explain it in court. Daniel seized the folded newspaper. The room erupted into movement. Anita shouted. A chair scraped. The elderly man stood. Martin held on to the paper with both hands, but Daniel was stronger and pulled it free. The newspaper tore open. Nothing fell out. Daniel stared at the empty pages. Clara understood at the same instant he did. Martin had come in as a distraction. The external drive was not with him. Through the front windows, Clara saw a figure outside crossing the square with one arm in a sling. Margaret. She moved slowly, painfully but steadily toward the post office next door, where public photocopying, printing and internet services were advertised in the window. Martin had not stayed with her at the hospital after all. Or perhaps she had refused to stay. Either way, the evidence chain had split again. Daniel turned toward the window. The upload reached 41%. Clara clicked send on the first email with the smaller audio file attached. The page froze. For a moment nothing happened. Then, sent. One copy gone. Daniel ran for the door. 2 library patrons moved without planning to become heroes. The elderly man stepped into his path with a newspaper still in hand. The teenager at the terminal pushed his chair backward into Daniel's legs. It was clumsy and brief, but it bought seconds. Daniel stumbled, caught himself, and shoved past them with a flash of anger no professional polish could hide. Anita shouted into the phone, He is leaving. He is leaving now. The upload reached 57%. Clara sent the second email, then the third. Outside, Daniel crossed toward the post office. Martin went after him, limping. Through the glass, Clara saw Margaret disappear inside the neighboring building. A white van engine started in the loading bay. The National Crime Agency upload failed. A red error message appeared on the screen. Connection interrupted. Clara stared at it, all warmth draining from her body. Then the library lights flickered. Several terminals went dark. A murmur spread through the room. Anita looked toward Clara. Backup power should hold the desk phone. But the computers were dead. The main evidence package had not uploaded. Clara pulled the memory card from the terminal and stood. The emails had sent only selected files. Enough to raise alarm, perhaps. Not enough to show the full structure. The full drive was now with Margaret. or soon would be if Daniel did not reach her first. Outside, the white van jolted forward. A police siren sounded in the distance. Daniel stopped halfway across the square, calculating. He looked toward the van, then toward the post office, then back at Clara through the library glass. For the first time, his face showed something like fear. Not fear of arrest, fear that the system he trusted to erase things had become too crowded with witnesses. The siren grew louder. Daniel made his choice. He ran to the van. Martin reached the post office door just as Margaret came out, pale but upright, clutching a padded mailing envelope in her good hand. She had mailed something, or pretended to, or copied it. Clara could not tell. The van pulled away from the loading bay, tires spraying water, and turned hard toward the road out of town. The police car entered the square from the opposite side. For one breathless second, Clara thought it would block the van. It did not. The van mounted the curb, clipped a bollard, and forced through the narrow gap beside a delivery lorry. People shouted. The police car braked, reversed, and swung after it, siren rising. Daniel Hart vanished into the morning traffic. Clara stood behind the library window, shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the terminal desk. Around her, the library had become a place of whispers, questions, concerned faces. Anita approached slowly, as if Clara might collapse if startled. "Help is coming," she said. Clara nodded, though she no longer knew what help meant. Across the square, Margaret lowered herself onto a bench. Martin stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. The post office clerk had come outside and was speaking animatedly to a police officer. More sirens sounded now, one close, another farther away. The truth had been released, not cleanly, not completely, not in the way Clara had planned. It had gone out in fragments, emails, audio clips, mailed copies, witness statements, police calls, memories spoken at last. Enough perhaps to stop the next drop. Enough perhaps to bring investigators to Blackrock before 3:14, but not enough to name the highest hand with certainty. On the library screen, after the power flickered back, the failed upload page refreshed itself. The form was empty. All unsent fields were gone. Clara looked down at the memory card in her palm. Then her phone buzzed. No caller ID. She should not have answered, but she did. For 2 seconds, there was only static. Then a man's voice spoke, older than Daniel's, smoother than Merrick's, and perfectly calm. "Miss Evans," he said, "you have made a grave mistake. The lighthouse was never the beginning." The line went dead. By the time the first national officers arrived, the rain had stopped. It left Helston looking washed and uncertain, the way towns look after a disturbance has passed through them without explanation. Water clung to the curbs. Shop windows reflected a pale morning sky. The square outside the library was taped off in sections by local police who seemed unsure whether they were dealing with a public order incident, a stolen laptop, a data breach, or the edge of something far larger than their morning briefing had prepared them to understand. Clara Evans sat in a staff office at the back of the library with a blanket around her shoulders and the memory card held inside an evidence bag on the desk before her. Anita, the librarian, had refused to leave until someone senior took her statement properly. Martin Prowse sat in another room, speaking to 2 officers with the exhausted precision of a man determined not to minimize his own failures. Margaret Lanyon had been taken back to hospital under protest, though not before insisting that the padded envelope she had mailed from the post office be recorded, tracked, and photographed. She would not say aloud what was inside until an officer wrote down the chain of custody in front of her. That phrase had become important now. Chain of custody. For years it had belonged to Clara's work in quiet archives, to gloves and acid-free folders, to handwritten ledgers and digitized scans. Now it attached itself to blood on her palms, mud on her boots, Peter Lanyon's old dictaphone, a copied audio file, a corrupted upload form, and a hidden system built inside a lighthouse that most people would never visit. The first officer from the National Crime Agency arrived just after noon. Her name was Reena Patel. She was not theatrical. She did not stride into the library with a team of armed men and a promise to fix everything. She was in her early 50s, composed, tired-eyed, and careful in the way serious investigators become careful after years of learning how much damage can be done by certainty arriving too early. She listened. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Reena Patel listened without interrupting as Clara explained the repeating 4-minute loops, the 72-hour cycle, the 3:14 a.m. timing, the slack tide overlaps, the contractor logins, Peter's notes, Margaret's account of the audio, Daniel Hart's attempts to retrieve the files, Owen Merrick's pursuit, and the strange final call from the unknown older man. Clara did not embellish. She did not accuse beyond what the evidence could support. When she mentioned Sir Alistair Ereven, she used the same careful phrasing she had typed into her lost briefing. His name appears in an unverified handwritten note by Peter Lanyon, and in the recovered audio phrase. I cannot state what role, if any, he had. I can only say that Peter considered the name relevant, and the audio appears to include it. Reena Patel wrote that down exactly. Good, she said quietly. Clara looked at her. Good? Careful people are useful? It was the first kind thing anyone had said about Clara's caution in a long time. By mid-afternoon, the investigation had moved beyond the library. Officers secured Clara's cottage, Margaret's house, the chapel, the boatyard, the boathouse, and the Maritime Records Trust. The storage facility near Cambourne was placed under review. Its manager, pale and visibly shaken, admitted that a courier had collected the early automation box that morning, using documentation that appeared valid at first glance. The box was later found abandoned in a lay-by, soaked through, its contents partly destroyed. Some papers survived, the original drives did not. Daniel Hart's van was found before evening on an industrial estate outside Truro. Daniel was not inside. Neither was Owen Merrick. The stolen laptop had been wiped and left on the passenger seat, its drive damaged beyond easy recovery. To the first technicians, it looked like a dead end. To Clara, it looked like confirmation. People did not destroy empty things with such urgency. The most important hours came after dark. At 3:14 a.m., when the next 72-hour interval arrived, Blackrock Point was no longer watched only by its own automated system. It was watched from the air, from the water, from thermal cameras, from officers positioned on the cliff road, and from a Coast Guard vessel standing beyond the cove with its lights reduced. The official public feed from the lighthouse behaved exactly as Clara had predicted. For 4 minutes, it lied. The sea on the archive screen continued moving in a smooth, ordinary darkness. The timestamp advanced. The lighthouse beam crossed the frame as if nothing in the world had changed. But the independent cameras saw something else. At the mouth of Blackrock Cove, beneath the cliff and just beyond the broken white edge of the tide, a low shape surfaced briefly in the water. It was not large. It did not look like the machines imagined in films. It looked functional, dark, and almost ugly. A compact submersible or semi-submerged craft, adapted for concealment rather than distance. 2 small boats moved from the rocks to meet it. The lighthouse beam shifted by a fraction, just as Peter had noted years before, leaving the cove in a pocket of darkness that did not belong to the rest of the coast. The interception was not clean. Real operations rarely are. One boat turned back toward open water and was lost for several minutes in fog before being stopped near the outer rocks. Another grounded on a submerged ledge. 2 men fled onto the lower cliff path and were later found hiding in an old mine adit above the cove. The dark craft itself began to sink after its operators attempted to scuttle it, forcing officers and Coast Guard crews into a dangerous recovery in cold water. Inside they found sealed containers, some held contraband, one did not. The public would not hear the full details for a long time. Even then, they would hear them in guarded language. Vulnerable persons recovered, ongoing safeguarding investigation, suspected organized criminal network, multi-agency response. Names and ages were withheld. Origins were withheld. Medical details were withheld. That restraint frustrated the hungry parts of the internet, but Clara was grateful for it. People were not clues. People were not atmosphere. People were not proof to be displayed for strangers. In the days that followed, arrests were made quietly across Cornwall and beyond. A director of Kerno Marine Systems was detained. 2 subcontractors were questioned. Bank accounts were frozen, servers were seized. Maintenance logs that had once appeared dull and harmless became central to an inquiry that widened with each passing week. Daniel Hart was arrested at a private airfield 3 days later under a different name. Owen Merrick was found on a fishing boat off the south coast after injuring his hand badly enough to require treatment. He said almost nothing after his arrest. Sir Alistair Venn released a statement through solicitors denying any involvement in criminal activity. He described references to his name as speculative, misleading, and potentially defamatory. He stated that his past work on maritime resilience had been lawful, limited, and fully documented. No charge was announced against him in the immediate aftermath. That fact disappointed people who wanted the story to end with a single face. Clara understood the disappointment, but she no longer trusted simple endings. The lighthouse had never been the beginning, the unknown caller had said. She thought about that sentence often. At first, investigators treated it as intimidation, a final attempt to frighten her into silence. Perhaps it was. But as more records surfaced, the sentence took on another meaning. Blackrock Point was not an isolated invention. It was one node in a larger architecture of convenience: automated coastal systems, subcontracted maintenance, legacy security permissions, private access agreements, unexamined software updates, and old assumptions that machines were more neutral than people. The crime had lived not outside modern oversight, but inside its confidence. That was the part Clara could not forget. Weeks later, she returned to her cottage. The study window had been cleaned, though in certain weather she imagined she could still see the faint circle around those 3 letters. The phone line was repaired. The router blinked green again. The chair no longer sat beneath the front door handle. Bosun came back from the neighbor's shed after 4 days and behaved as if the entire affair had been an inconvenience arranged for his personal irritation. Clara tried to resume work. At first, every archive feed looked suspicious. Every timestamp felt like a dare. She found herself pausing videos not for evidence, but for reassurance that waves did not repeat too perfectly, that birds crossed the sky in the proper direction, that lighthouse beams behaved as they were meant to. The screen, once her shelter, had become a window with unknown hands behind it. Martin resigned from the trust before anyone asked him to. His resignation letter was brief and unsparing. He took responsibility for failing to act on Peter Lanyon's concerns when they first reached him. Some trustees considered the statement too harsh. Martin disagreed. He began assisting investigators full-time with historical records from the automation rollout. Not because it redeemed him, he told Clara, but because redemption was too grand a word for paperwork done late. Margaret Lanyon attended Peter's reopened inquest with her arm still in a sling. The original conclusion was not dramatically overturned in a single emotional day. There were adjournments, expert statements, missing records, legal arguments over scope. But Peter was no longer described merely as an anxious old man who had wandered too close to a cliff in bad weather. His findings were entered into the record. His dictaphone was entered into evidence. His caution, once mistaken for obsession, became part of the chain that led others to Blackrock Cove. For Margaret, that was not closure. But it was a correction, and sometimes correction is the only justice the dead can receive. Clara gave one interview months later after repeated requests and only on the condition that no recovered victims were identified, no unsupported allegations were amplified, and Peter's work was treated with dignity. The interviewer expected a dramatic account of escape, pursuit, hidden smugglers, and the night at the library. Clara gave them something quieter. She spoke about archives. She spoke about how records can be altered without appearing broken. How public trust often rests on systems ordinary citizens are not allowed to inspect. How automation does not remove human intention but can conceal it behind cleaner interfaces. How a 4-minute lie, repeated often enough, can become part of the official memory of a coastline. Near the end, the interviewer asked whether she felt safe now. Clara looked past the camera toward the window. Outside, rain moved over the glass in thin, wavering lines. "No," she said, "but I feel less obedient to fear." That answer stayed in the final edit. Not everything else did. Months passed. Blackrock Point remained closed to the public while its systems were stripped, audited, and rebuilt. The old feed disappeared from the archive. In its place appeared a notice citing an ongoing investigation. Tourists still came to the nearby cliffs in summer, taking photographs of the sea without knowing exactly where the darkness had once been arranged for someone else's use. The lighthouse itself continued turning. It had no guilt, no memory, no intention of its own. It had only done what it had been instructed to do. That, Clara thought, was perhaps the most unsettling part. One evening in late autumn, almost a year after the gull flew backward across her screen, Clara stood outside her cottage at dusk. She had begun taking short walks again, first to the gate, then to the lane, then as far as the bend where the hedges opened and the sea became visible between fields. Progress was not cinematic. It was humiliatingly small, often reversed by bad days, often invisible to anyone who did not know what each step cost. But on that evening, she reached the bend. The Atlantic lay beyond the headland, darkening under a sky the color of pewter. Far away, a lighthouse beam swept once across low cloud and vanished. Clara watched it return, steady and pale, marking danger by refusing to hide it. In her coat pocket, her phone vibrated. No caller ID. She let it ring until it stopped. A voicemail appeared. For a long time, she did not play it. Then she did. There was no voice, only static, wind, and beneath both, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a clock ticking. 3 minutes and 14 seconds into the message, it ended. Clara stood in the lane until the sky darkened completely. She never learned who sent it. Perhaps it was a threat, perhaps a cruel joke, perhaps an automated error pulled from some broken corner of a system still not fully understood. Investigators logged it, traced what they could, and found nothing useful. The case continued, widened, slowed, and disappeared from public attention in the way even serious cases do when they become complicated enough. But Clara kept the voicemail, not because it proved anything, because it reminded her of what proof cannot always reach. There are places in the modern world where cameras look without seeing, where systems record without remembering, where official time moves forward while the truth is held back for 4 minutes at a time. Most people will never notice those gaps. They are too small, too technical, too well hidden inside the machinery of ordinary trust. But sometimes a gull flies backward. Sometimes an old man writes a note and hides a voice in a boat. Sometimes a frightened woman leaves her house in the rain and carries a record into the open. And sometimes the darkness is not defeated. It is only interrupted long enough for someone to count what was missing. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment, and sharing the video with someone who enjoys slow-burn mysteries and hidden investigations. Some stories end with answers. Others end by teaching us where to look.